I always thought my family's secrets were buried deep. But that night, in my father's study, I learned they were alive and laughing. Ellie stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway of the family mansion, her breath hitching as she strained to hear through the thick oak door. The sound was unmistakable, a rich, throaty laugh that belonged to her grandmother, Maggie. But it wasn't the kind of laugh Ellie grew up hearing at family dinners or during Maggie's countless anecdotes about her youth. This was different. It was intimate, seductive. Her pulse quickened as she took a step closer, the floorboard creaking beneath her weight. The laughter stopped abruptly. Ellie's heart thudded in her ears, the silence that followed more unnerving than the sound itself. She pressed herself against the wall, willing herself invisible, as a low murmur of voices seeped through the door. "You're playing a dangerous game, Margaret," her father's voice said, low and strained. "Dangerous games are my favorite, darling," Maggie purred, the playfulness in her tone sending a shiver down Ellie's spine. The mansion, a sprawling relic of old money and faded glory, suddenly felt like a tomb. The portraits on the walls, usually comforting reminders of family history, now seemed to leer at her, their eyes filled with judgment. Ellie tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt thick, suffocating. For weeks, she'd sensed something was off, a lingering glance here, a whispered conversation there. But she had convinced herself she was imagining things. Now there was no denying it. The tension in the house wasn't in her head. It was real, and it was emanating from the two people behind that door. The sharp scent of Maggie's perfume wafted under the door, a cloying blend of roses and something darker, muskier. Ellie's stomach churned as the smell brought back memories of her grandmother's careful hugs, the way Maggie would tilt her head and smile as if she knew a secret no one else did. That smile no longer felt endearing. It felt sinister. The grandfather clock at the end of the hallway chimed once, its deep, resonant tone vibrating through the floor. Ellie flinched, the sound jarring her out of her spiraling thoughts. Inside the study, the voices paused again, her palms damp with sweat. Ellie stepped back, her instincts screaming at her to flee. But curiosity and dread kept her rooted in place. A memory surfaced, a hazy, disjointed scene from her childhood. She was 8 years old, playing hide-and-seek in the garden. She'd hidden behind the rose bushes and stumbled upon Maggie and her father standing too close, their heads bent in a whispered conversation. "You have to be careful," her father had said, his voice tight. Maggie had only laughed, that same throaty laugh that now sent chills down Ellie's spine. She hadn't understood the weight of it then. Now, the memory felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place, revealing a picture she wasn't ready to see. The study door creaked open, and Ellie's breath hitched. She ducked into the shadows just as her father stepped into the hallway, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his tie, his movements jerky, before disappearing down the corridor. Ellie's heart pounded as she waited for Maggie to emerge. But the door remained ajar, the room beyond bathed in the golden glow of a desk lamp. Unable to stop herself, Ellie crept closer. The study smelled of her father's cologne and cigar smoke, but the air was heavy with something else. Secrecy, betrayal. On the desk, a crystal glass of amber liquid sat beside an envelope with her name scrawled across it in Maggie's elegant handwriting. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. She hesitated, a voice in her head screaming not to open it. But she had to know. Inside was a single piece of paper, its edges slightly frayed. Ellie unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the neat, flowing script. "Ellie, you're stronger than you think. But some truths are too dangerous to face head-on. When the time comes, trust your instincts. And remember, I love you. Maggie." The note made no sense, yet it confirmed Ellie's worst fears. Maggie knew she was onto something. The laughter, the conversation, the note, it was all connected. But how? And why? Before Ellie could process the message, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her stomach dropping as she read the text. "You should have stayed out of it, Ellie. Now it's too late. Her heart raced as she stared at the unknown number, her hands clammy with fear. The sender's name was Margaret. Ellie's grip on the phone tightened as she turned toward the door. Maggie stood there, framed in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "It's time we talked, dear," Maggie said, her voice calm, almost soothing. Ellie's blood ran cold as her grandmother stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. How do you confront someone who wears betrayal like a second skin and smiles at you as if nothing's wrong? Ellie sat at the edge of her bed, Maggie's note clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The words swam before her eyes as her mind raced. What did Maggie mean by too dangerous to face head-on? And why had her grandmother sent a text warning her to stay out of it? The study's lingering scent of roses and cigar smoke still clung to her, a ghostly reminder of what she had overheard. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run far from this house and the secrets it buried. But she couldn't. Not yet. She had to know what Maggie was hiding and, more importantly, why her father seemed complicit. A knock at the door shattered Ellie's spiraling thoughts. She shoved the note under her pillow and tried to steady her breathing. The door creaked open, and there stood her father, Daniel, his tie loosened and his face lined with exhaustion. Or was it guilt? "You're still up?" he asked, his voice calm but cautious. Ellie forced a smile, her fingers gripping the bedspread to hide their trembling. "Just couldn't sleep," she replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the note under her pillow a burning secret. Daniel's eyes lingered on her a moment too long before he nodded. "Try to get some rest. Big day tomorrow," he said, his words heavy with unspoken meaning. As he turned to leave, Ellie couldn't stop herself. "Dad," she called out, her voice cracking slightly. "Are you okay? You seem different." He paused, his back still to her. For a moment, she thought he might confess something, anything. But then he turned, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm fine, Ellie. Just tired. Good night." The door clicked shut, leaving Ellie drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. The next morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Maggie was in the kitchen, humming an old tune as she prepared breakfast, her movements graceful and deliberate. Ellie watched her from the doorway, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with Maggie's signature perfume, a scent that now felt more sinister than comforting. "You're staring, dear," Maggie said without turning, her voice light but laced with an edge. Ellie startled, forcing a laugh. "Just wondering how you managed to look so put together in the morning," she said, masking her unease. Maggie turned, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Experience, darling. You learn a thing or two over the years." Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that Maggie's words were a double-edged sword. Was she hinting at her secrets, or was Ellie reading too much into everything? As Ellie sat at the table, another memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. She was 12, and Maggie had taken her to a neighbor's party. It had been a lavish affair with music, laughter, and plenty of champagne. Ellie had wandered off and accidentally stumbled upon Maggie in the garden, leaning far too close to the host, Mr. Harper. "You're incorrigible, Margaret," he'd whispered, his hand grazing hers. "And you love it," Maggie had replied, her laugh light and flirtatious. Ellie hadn't understood the implications then, but now the memory made her skin crawl. How many times had Maggie crossed lines under the guise of charm and sophistication? Later that afternoon, Ellie wandered into the study, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. She needed answers, and she was determined to find them. The room felt colder than before, the shadows deeper. On the desk, a stack of papers caught her eye. Among them was an old photograph, one she didn't recognize. It was of her father, younger and smiling, with Maggie beside him. But there was something about the way they stood, too close, too intimate. Maggie's hand rested on Daniel's arm, her fingers curling possessively. Ellie's stomach churned as she turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back were the words, always my Daniel. Love, Maggie. Her breath caught in her throat. The photograph felt like a ticking time bomb in her hands. What kind of relationship did Maggie and Daniel have? And how far did it go? As Ellie stared at the photograph, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. She froze, her pulse racing. Quickly, she tucked a photo back into the pile and stepped away from the desk just as Maggie appeared in the doorway. "Looking for something, dear?" Maggie asked, her tone pleasant but her eyes sharp. Ellie's mouth went dry. "Just killing time," she stammered, hoping her face didn't betray her panic. Maggie smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "Be careful where you wander, Ellie. This house has a way of revealing things you're not ready to see." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ellie forced a laugh, but her heart was pounding. Maggie stepped closer, her perfume enveloping the room. "You've always been curious, haven't you? It's one of your best traits," Maggie said softly, her hand brushing Ellie's shoulder. "Just remember, curiosity can be dangerous." Ellie nodded mutely, her mind racing as Maggie left the room. She looked back at the desk, the photograph burning in her memory. For the first time, Ellie wondered if she had underestimated Maggie. And if she had, what would it cost her? Some doors should never be opened, especially the ones that promised to change everything you thought you knew. Ellie's fingers hovered over the brass doorknob of the attic room, a place she had rarely been allowed to enter. Maggie's cryptic warning echoed in her mind. This house has a way of revealing things you're not ready to see. But Ellie had never been one to back away from curiosity, even when it clawed at her nerves. Why had Maggie been so protective of this room? And what could possibly be hiding behind its heavy wooden door? The door creaked open, revealing a space shrouded in dust and shadows. The attic was cold despite the summer heat, the air thick with the scent of mothballs and aged wood. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, their labels faded and cryptic. Summer 1978. Family keepsakes and "Do not touch." Ellie's pulse quickened as she scanned the room. Her eyes landed on a cedar chest in the corner, its surface scratched and worn with time. Unlike the rest of the attic, it seemed out of place, deliberately placed, almost as if it were meant to be hidden in plain sight. She hesitated. The chest seemed to hum with secrets, its presence both inviting and menacing. Was it guilt or dread that tightened her chest as she knelt beside it? The lock on the chest was old and rusted, but a gentle tug was enough to break it open. Ellie's breath hitched as she lifted the lid, the hinges groaning like an old man's complaint. Inside, a collection of photographs, letters, and trinkets lay nestled together, whispering stories from a forgotten time. The first item she pulled out was a photograph, another one of her father, Daniel, and Maggie. This time they stood by a Christmas tree, laughing, their heads tilted toward each other in a way that sent a chill down Ellie's spine. The intimacy in their body language was unmistakable. Below the photograph was a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. Ellie's hands shook as she untied the knot and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant and unmistakably Maggie's. "My dearest Daniel, I think of you every moment, even when I know I shouldn't. You've always been my greatest joy and my deepest regret. I'll keep our secret safe. No one will ever know what we've shared." Ellie's heart dropped. What secret? The words blurred as a wave of nausea hit her. She frantically shuffled through the other letters, each one a mix of longing and forbidden love, but none revealing the full truth. The creak of footsteps on the attic stairs jolted Ellie from her discovery. She scrambled to shove the letters back into the chest, her mind racing. Who was coming? She pushed the lid shut just as the door opened, revealing Maggie standing there, her expression unreadable. "Ellie," Maggie said, her voice calm but icy. "I thought I told you not to wander." Ellie stood frozen, her heart pounding. "I wasn't. I didn't mean to." Maggie's eyes narrowed, her gaze darting to the chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Then Maggie smiled, a slow, calculated curve of her lips. The past has a way of trapping people. "Darling," she said softly, stepping further into the room, "you should be careful what you go looking for. Not all truths are meant to be uncovered." Maggie reached down and gently closed the chest, her hand lingering on the worn wood, as if it were an old friend. Her eyes met Ellie's, and for a fleeting moment, Ellie saw something vulnerable in her grandmother's gaze, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by Maggie's usual mask of control. "This chest holds memories," Maggie said, her tone almost wistful. "Some sweet, some bitter. But remember, Ellie, memories are like fire. They can warm you, or they can burn you alive." Ellie swallowed hard, the weight of the letters pressing on her mind. I wanted to understand," she whispered. Maggie's smile softened, but her words carried a sharp edge. "Understanding doesn't always bring peace, my dear. Sometimes it only brings pain." With that, she turned and left the attic, leaving Ellie alone with the chest and a storm of questions. After Maggie's departure, Ellie sat back down, her mind spinning. What had she stumbled upon? The letters hinted at something deeply troubling, but they didn't give her the whole picture. There was still so much she didn't understand. As she shifted the items in the chest, her fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound diary. Its edges were frayed, and its pages yellowed with age. The initials M.W. were embossed on the cover. Ellie's pulse quickened as she opened it to the first page. "To my Daniel, my only love. This diary is for us. A place to keep what the world can never know." Ellie's stomach churned. This was more than a grandmother's harmless keepsake. This was a window into a forbidden relationship, and the more she read, the more she realized that the truth might be darker than she had ever imagined. Ellie's eyes widened as she flipped to the last entry, dated only 2 weeks prior. "I've always known how to keep a secret, but Ellie is getting too close. If she finds out, everything will unravel. I must act quickly before it's too late." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Maggie wasn't just guarding secrets. She was protecting herself from something much bigger. But what would Maggie do if she felt cornered? "I thought I had heard the last of the secrets, but the knock at the door that night told me I was wrong." The sound was sharp and insistent, breaking the stillness of the evening. Ellie froze mid-step, her mind still reeling from the discovery in the attic. She glanced toward the door and then back at Maggie, who was sitting calmly on the living room couch, knitting as if the world outside didn't exist. But Maggie's calmness wasn't comforting. It was unnerving. She didn't even flinch at the knock, as though she had been expecting it. "Aren't you going to answer it?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maggie's hands didn't stop moving, the needles clicking together rhythmically. "Not all visitors bring good news, darling. Sometimes it's better to leave the door closed." Ellie hesitated. The knock came again, louder this time. Whoever was out there wasn't going to leave any time soon. Swallowing her nerves, she moved toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the silent house. When Ellie opened the door, the last person she expected to see was a man in his late 50s, his face weathered and lined with worry. He held a folder in one hand, his other clenching the edge of the porch railing like he needed it to steady himself. "Ellie Whitmore?" he asked, his voice gravelly and uncertain. Ellie nodded. "Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes darted over her shoulder, scanning the dimly lit living room behind her. When he spotted Maggie, his jaw tightened. He took a step back, as if he was debating whether to leave. "I'm Henry," he finally said. "Henry Pierce. I knew your father. And your grandmother." The mention of her father made Ellie's stomach twist. The tension between her and Maggie was already unbearable, and now this stranger had appeared, dragging her father's name into the mix. Ellie glanced back at Maggie, whose knitting needles had stopped mid-stitch. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes burned with an intensity that sent a chill down Ellie's spine. "What do you want?" Ellie asked, her voice firm but trembling. Henry hesitated again, before holding up the folder. This is something you need to see. It's about your family, about the things you've been left in the dark about. Before Ellie could reach for the folder, Maggie's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Ellie, close the door. Ellie turned, startled by the force in her grandmother's tone. Maggie was standing now, her knitting abandoned on the couch. There was a fire in her eyes that Ellie hadn't seen before, a mix of anger and fear. This man has no business here, Maggie said, stepping closer. Whatever he's brought, it's nothing but lies. Henry's laugh was bitter. Still playing the victim, are you, Maggie? You haven't changed one bit, and you're still meddling where you don't belong. Maggie shot back. Her voice was cold, but her hands were trembling. Ellie noticed and filed it away. Maggie never trembled. Stop it! Ellie snapped, her voice cutting through their tense exchange. I'm sick of his secrets. If he has something to say, I want to hear it. Henry handed Ellie the folder, his eyes softening. Be careful, kid, he said quietly. The truth isn't always what you hope it'll be. Ellie opened the folder, her hands shaking. Inside were photographs and documents. Pages and pages of information that painted a picture far different from the one she'd grown up believing. One photo in particular made her breath catch. It was an old Polaroid of her father and Maggie, their arms around each other in a way that was too intimate for a mother and son. The caption scrawled beneath it read, Daniel and Maggie, Winter 1985. Ellie's knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the floor. She flipped through the pages, each one more damning than the last. There were letters between Maggie and her neighbors, suggesting more relationships that blurred the lines of loyalty and betrayal. Bank statements showed large sums of money being transferred in and out of accounts she didn't recognize. And then there were the testimonies, statements from people who had known Maggie and her web of lies. This can't be real, Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. Maggie stepped forward, her face pale, but her voice steady. People will go to great lengths to tarnish a woman's name, she said, especially a woman who doesn't fit into their little boxes of morality. Ellie looked up at her, tears streaming down her face. Is it true, Maggie? Did you do all of this? Maggie knelt in front of her, her expression softening for the first time. Ellie, the world isn't black and white. There are things I've done to protect this family, to ensure we survived. If that makes me a villain in your eyes, so be it. But don't think for a second that you know the whole story. Henry scoffed from the doorway. She's a master at twisting the truth, Ellie. Don't let her manipulate you like she's done to everyone else. Ellie's hands clenched the folder as her mind raced. Who was telling the truth? Was Maggie the manipulative woman Henry claimed she was? Or was Henry the liar trying to dismantle her family? Maggie stood, her voice calm but firm. Ellie, you need to decide who you trust. But just remember this. Once you open Pandora's box, there's no closing it again. Henry's parting words echoed in Ellie's mind as he walked away. Pandora's box has already been opened, kid. Now you just need to brace yourself for what comes next. As Ellie watched him disappear into the night, she realized one thing. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I should have left the folder untouched, but curiosity is a cruel master. One that led me to the garden that night, chasing shadows I wasn't prepared to face. The house had grown eerily quiet. Ellie sat in her room, the folder spread out on the bed like a Pandora's box she'd foolishly opened. The photograph of Maggie and her father, Daniel, haunted her. Their faces beamed in the image, but the closeness between them made Ellie's stomach churn. What did it mean? Was it just a poorly captured moment? Or was there a darker truth she hadn't yet uncovered? Maggie's words echoed in her mind. There are things I've done to protect this family, but what could possibly justify this? The letters, the transactions, the photographs, it was too much, too tangled, to make sense of all at once. Her hands trembled as she picked up another document, a letter written in neat cursive. It was unsigned but unmistakably addressed to Maggie. The opening line sent a chill down her spine. We both know the truth about Daniel. How long can you keep it hidden? Ellie's thoughts spiraled as the house creaked around her, every noise amplified in the silence. She shoved the documents back into the folder, deciding she needed air. The walls of the house felt suffocating, oppressive, as if they too held secrets she couldn't bear to face. She slipped on her coat and stepped out into the garden, the cool night air wrapping around her like a shroud. The moonlight bathed the space in a pale glow, illuminating the neatly trimmed hedges and the stone path that wound through the flower beds. It was a garden she'd played in as a child, where Maggie used to tell her stories about fairies and secret worlds. But now it felt different, darker, heavier, as though it had absorbed the weight of every secret Maggie had buried. Ellie walked aimlessly at first, trying to clear her head, but her steps slowed as she neared the far corner of the garden, where an old stone bench sat beneath a gnarled oak tree. It was Maggie's favorite spot, a place she often retreated to with her knitting or a book. But tonight something was different. The ground near the bench looked disturbed, the soil uneven as though someone had been digging. Her heart raced as she knelt down, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the loose earth. What was buried here? Another secret? Another lie? Ellie hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but the compulsion to uncover the truth was stronger than her fear. Using a nearby garden trowel, she began to dig. After a few minutes, her fingers hit something solid. She cleared the soil away, revealing a small, rusted tin box. Her breath caught as she pried it open. Inside were more photographs, brittle with age, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Ellie's hands shook as she pulled out the top photo. It was of her father, Daniel, and another woman, a stranger with dark hair and piercing eyes. The two of them stood arm in arm, smiling at the camera. On the back of the photo, written in the same neat cursive as the letter she'd read earlier, were the words, "The love we weren't allowed to have." Ellie's mind reeled. Who was this woman? And what did she mean to her father? The letters might hold the answers. But before Ellie could open one, a voice cut through the night. "What do you think you're doing?" Ellie jumped, nearly dropping the box. She spun around to see Maggie, standing a few feet away, her figure barely visible in the shadows. Her voice was calm, but her eyes glinted with an intensity that made Ellie's skin crawl. "You shouldn't be out here," Maggie said, stepping closer. "It's late." Ellie clenched the box to her chest. "What is this, Maggie? Who is she?" Maggie's gaze flicked to the box, and for a fleeting moment, Ellie thought she saw fear in her grandmother's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. "That's none of your concern," Maggie said. "You're meddling in things you don't understand." "Don't understand!" Ellie snapped, her voice rising. "How can I understand anything when all you do is lie and hide the truth? Who is she, Maggie? What are you hiding from me?" Maggie sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. For the first time, she looked weary, her usual composure cracking. Her name was Evelyn, Maggie said finally. She and your father were close, but their relationship was complicated. Complicated how? Ellie pressed, desperate for answers. Maggie hesitated, then shook her head. "It's not my story to tell." "But he's gone," Ellie said, her voice breaking. "He's not here to tell it, Maggie. You are, and I need to know the truth." Maggie stared at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she turned and began walking back toward the house. "Some truths are better left buried, Ellie. Remember that." Ellie watched her go, her mind racing. The tin box in her hands felt like a ticking time bomb, each photograph and letter a piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. As she stood alone in the garden, the shadows seemed to close in around her, and a single thought echoed in her mind. How much more could she uncover before the weight of it all crushed her? The box was heavy in her hands, but not as heavy as the secrets it contained. And Ellie knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop now. What if the truth you're searching for shatters your entire world? Ellie stared at the photograph in her trembling hands, her pulse roaring in her ears. How could Maggie smile so warmly in this picture, while standing so close to her father? The intimacy in their body language wasn't subtle, it was unsettling. Was she imagining things? No, this was real. Too real. But why would Maggie hide something so explosive in plain sight? And why now, years after Ellie's mother had disappeared, was the truth clawing its way to the surface? The text message from the unknown number echoed in her head. Stop looking for answers. You won't like what you find. Was this a warning or a threat? Could a single box destroy an entire family? Ellie's fingers skimmed the edge of the tin box, each item inside unraveling the carefully constructed tapestry of her life. The letters, the photographs, the delicate gold necklace that once belonged to her mother. How had Maggie ended up with it? And what did it mean? Her gaze darted to the letters again. The handwriting was unmistakably Maggie's, each word dripping with forbidden longing. Who was she writing to? Ellie's breath hitched as her eyes fell on a line that made her heart stop. I know what we're doing is wrong, but when I'm with you, it doesn't feel that way. Ellie felt her knees buckle. Wrong. What was wrong? And with whom? Could it really be her father? But what if there was someone else? Someone she hadn't considered yet. A neighbor? A friend? Or worse, someone she trusted? The possibilities swirled in her mind, each one darker than the last. Why was her phone ringing now? The sudden shrill broke through the suffocating silence of the attic. Ellie fumbled to answer, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The screen flashed Dad. Was this a coincidence or something darker? Ellie, her father's voice was calm, too calm. Dad, she said, her voice shaky. Did you text me earlier? What text? He asked, his tone suddenly defensive. Ellie's stomach churned. The one telling me to stop digging into Maggie's things. For a moment, the line was silent. Then came his reply, cold and calculated. Ellie, leave it alone. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. Why would her father, the man who had always encouraged her curiosity, want her to stop now? What didn't he want her to know? Her hand tightened around the phone, her mind racing. Was her father involved in whatever Maggie was hiding? Or was he trying to protect her from something even worse? Why did Maggie keep the drawer locked? Ellie's eyes settled on the desk in the corner of the attic, its dark wood polished and pristine. The keys to the drawer hung around Maggie's neck like some sacred artifact. What was so dangerous about what lay inside? Ellie's memories flooded back to childhood summers, when she would beg Maggie to show her what was in that drawer. Maggie would only smile, her voice dripping with sweetness. Some secrets aren't meant for little girls. Dear. Now, Ellie wasn't a little girl anymore. She was a woman desperate for answers. Her hand reached for the drawer, but the lock held firm. She cursed under her breath. How would she get inside? Her gaze flickered to the attic window. The wind howled outside, rattling the panes. The eerie atmosphere seemed to mirror her growing unease. If the drawer held the key to unraveling Maggie's secrets, then she had to open it, no matter what. Could Maggie sense Ellie's desperation? Descending the stairs felt like walking into the lion's den. Maggie sat in her rocking chair, knitting as if the world wasn't crumbling around her. Her piercing eyes met Ellie's, sharp and knowing. What's wrong, dear? Maggie asked, her tone sugary sweet. Ellie hesitated. How much did Maggie already know? I found some letters. In the attic, Maggie's hands froze mid-stitch. The faintest flicker of unease crossed her face. Oh, did you now? Ellie's throat tightened. Why were they hidden? And who were you writing to? For the first time, Maggie's gaze faltered. She placed the knitting needles aside and leaned forward, her voice low and chilling. You don't want the answers to those questions, Ellie. Trust me. But Ellie couldn't trust her. Not after everything she'd seen. I'll find out with or without your help, she said, her voice trembling. Maggie's lips curled into a faint, cryptic smile. Be careful. Child, she murmured. Some doors can't be closed once they're opened. What was Maggie afraid of? Maggie rose from the chair with a grace that belied her age. Her face suddenly unreadable. She moved toward Ellie, her keys glinting under the light. "Be careful." "Ellie," she said softly, almost tenderly, "there's no undoing what you'll find." The words sent a chill down Ellie's spine. What did Maggie mean? Was this a warning or a confession? Ellie's jaw tightened as Maggie leaned in closer, her breath warm against Ellie's ear. "Sometimes," Maggie whispered, "it's better not to know." The words hung in the air, thick with foreboding. Ellie stepped back, her determination hardening. She wouldn't be scared off. The truth was close, she could feel it. But how much was Ellie willing to sacrifice to uncover it? As Maggie's haunting words replayed in her mind, Ellie clenched her fists. The truth had already begun unraveling, and there was no going back. The screen fades to black as Maggie's voice echoes ominously. Some secrets are meant to die with the ones who kept them. Why do the people you trust the most become the ones you fear the most? Ellie replayed her father's chilling words over and over. Some truths aren't meant to be uncovered. The phrase echoed like a warning bell, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. It was a plea. What did her father know that he wasn't telling her? And how was Maggie tied to this web of secrets? As Ellie stared at the locked drawer in the attic, she couldn't help but feel as though it held the answers to everything. But with no key and no way to confront Maggie again without raising more suspicion, she needed another plan. What if a single call could unravel everything you thought you knew? Ellie's phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. The caller ID was hidden. A cold dread seeped into her chest as she hesitated to answer. What if it was the same unknown number that had sent her the ominous text? Against her better judgment, she pressed accept. Ellie, a deep, raspy voice spoke on the other end. Her stomach tightened. Who is this? Someone who knows what Maggie has done, and what she's capable of, the voice replied. Ellie's breath hitched. What are you talking about? Who are you? I'm someone who tried to warn your mother, the caller said, his tone dripping with regret. But it was too late for her. Don't let it be too late for you. Her grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean? What happened to my mother? The line went dead. Was this a prank? Or was someone deliberately trying to stop her from finding the truth? Either way, Ellie's resolve only hardened. The more they tried to scare her, the more determined she became to expose whatever secrets Maggie had buried. What if the thing you've been searching for turns out to be something you wish you hadn't found? Ellie returned to the attic, the chill in the air matching the dread in her heart. The drawer might have been locked, but the rest of the attic was still a treasure trove of potential clues. She dug through boxes and suitcases, each one revealing pieces of Maggie's life she had never known. Old photographs of Maggie as a young woman, her beauty striking yet cold. Newspaper clippings of seemingly unrelated events. A fire at a neighbor's house, a missing person report, an obituary for a man named Richard Montgomery. Who was Richard Montgomery? Ellie's fingers brushed against an envelope hidden beneath a pile of faded journals. It was addressed to Maggie in elegant handwriting, the return address smudged beyond recognition. Inside was a letter, its contents sending a chill down Ellie's spine. Dearest Margaret, I can't stop thinking about what we did. It was wrong, yes, but it felt so right. The others would never understand, but you and I, we know the truth. We know what love truly means. Forever yours. R. The pieces clicked into place. The obituary, the missing person report, the fire, all connected to this Richard Montgomery. But who was he to Maggie? And more importantly, why had he disappeared? What if the answers are hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to look closer? As night fell, Ellie found herself drawn to the living room where Maggie sat every evening, humming an old tune and sipping her tea. There was something unsettling about the way Maggie carried herself, as though she was always one step ahead of everyone else. Ellie watched from the shadows as Maggie retrieved a small wooden box from the cabinet. She opened it delicately, pulling out a single photograph and holding it close to her chest. Ellie strained to see who was in the picture, but Maggie's grip was firm. "Maggie," Ellie said, stepping into the room. Maggie jumped, her eyes narrowing. "What are you doing up so late, dears?" Ellie gestured to the box. "What's that?" Maggie's smile was faint, almost sad. "Just memories, my dear. Memories that should stay where they belong, in the past." Ellie's pulse quickened. "Is it about Richard Montgomery?" The color drained from Maggie's face. "Where did you hear that name?" Her silence was damning, and Ellie pressed further. "What happened to him, Maggie? And what does he have to do with you and my father?" Maggie rose from her chair, her expression a mask of calm fury. "Ellie, you're playing with fire. You should let this go before someone gets hurt." But Ellie couldn't let it go. "Not now. Who's watching you when you think you're alone?" Later that night, Ellie sat in her room, her mind racing with everything she'd uncovered. The letter, the obituary, Maggie's cryptic warning, but none of it made sense yet. A soft creak outside her window made her freeze. Slowly, she turned her head, her heart pounding in her chest. A shadow moved just beyond the glass. Ellie bolted to her feet, throwing the curtains open. There was nothing there, but as her gaze dropped to the ground below, her breath caught. A muddy footprint on the windowsill. Someone had been watching her. What if the people closest to you are hiding the darkest truths? Ellie couldn't sleep. The muddy footprint outside her window burned in her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. Who had been there? Was it someone trying to scare her off, or had she stumbled into something much more dangerous than she'd imagined? Her thoughts kept circling back to the mysterious caller and the way Maggie had reacted to the name Richard Montgomery. There was something there, something her grandmother desperately wanted to bury. But why? And what did it mean for Ellie's family? What if the person who comes to her aid has secrets of their own? The next morning, Ellie decided she couldn't face this alone anymore. Her best friend, Lily, had always been her sounding board, and if anyone could help her piece this puzzle together, it was her. Ellie met Lily at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, but Ellie barely noticed. "I think someone was outside my window last night," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily's eyes widened. "Ellie, this is getting serious. Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Ellie shook her head. "It was real. And there's more. I found a letter in the attic addressed to Maggie. It mentioned someone named Richard Montgomery, and Maggie completely freaked out when I asked her about him." Lily leaned closer. "Did the letter say anything else?" Ellie hesitated, then recited the words she'd read. As she finished, Lily's expression darkened. "That doesn't sound like just an old flame," Lily said. "It sounds like he knew something dangerous." Ellie nodded. "But I don't know what. And now I feel like someone's watching me. Like they don't want me to find out." Lily took a deep breath. "Maybe it's time we dug a little deeper. What if a name in an obituary holds the key to unraveling everything?" Ellie and Lily spent the afternoon in the town library poring over old newspapers. It didn't take long to find Richard Montgomery's obituary, and as Ellie read it, her heart raced. Richard Montgomery, 48, died in a tragic accident at his family estate. Survived by his wife, Margaret Montgomery, and their son, Daniel. Ellie froze. Margaret Montgomery. Could that be Maggie? Lily's eyes widened. "Do you think?" Ellie nodded, her mind spinning. It has to be her. But if she was married to this man, why has she never mentioned him? And what happened to their son? The questions swirled like a storm in Ellie's mind. There was no way this could be a coincidence. Maggie had reinvented herself, burying her past so thoroughly that even her family didn't know the truth. What if someone is willing to do anything to keep you from learning the truth? As Ellie and Lily left the library, the crisp evening air did little to calm Ellie's nerves. She felt like someone was watching her again, and every shadow seemed to move. "Ellie, relax," Lily said, though her voice trembled slightly. "You're just paranoid because of everything that's happened." Ellie tried to believe her, but then she noticed a man in a dark coat standing across the street. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking at anything but her. "Lily," Ellie whispered. "Do you see him?" Lily followed Ellie's gaze and paled. "Let's go." They hurried down the street, their pace quickening as they turned corner after corner. But no matter where they went, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Finally, they ducked into a crowded diner, and Ellie turned to look out the window. The man was gone, but as Ellie's heart began to slow, she realized she had left something behind. The folder with Richard Montgomery's obituary. What if a single image can change everything you thought you knew? Back at home, Ellie decided to return to the attic. There had to be more clues hidden among Maggie's things. As she sifted through the boxes again, she found an old photograph tucked inside a leather-bound journal. The picture showed a young Maggie, no, Margaret, smiling beside Richard Montgomery. But there was someone else in the picture, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, standing between them. Ellie flipped the photo over and found a single word scrawled on the back. Daniel. Her heart sank. Was this the same Daniel her father had mentioned during their confrontation? The man Maggie had been involved with after Richard's death? The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was more disturbing than Ellie could have imagined. If Daniel was Maggie's son, what had happened to him? And why did Ellie's father seem to know so much about him? Suddenly, a creak sounded from the attic stairs, and Ellie's blood ran cold. What if your family isn't who you think they are? Ellie sat frozen in the attic, the photograph of Maggie, Richard, and Daniel trembling in her hands. The word Daniel scrawled on the back felt like a key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Who is this Daniel? Was he the same man her father had cryptically mentioned? Or was this yet another piece of Maggie's twisted puzzle? But the bigger question gnawed at Ellie. What else was Maggie hiding? And why did it seem like everyone who got too close paid a price? What if your questions put you in danger? The creak of the attic stairs snapped Ellie out of her thoughts. Her pulse raced as she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But the sound came again, deliberate and slow, as if someone was deliberately letting her know they were there. Ellie! A voice called softly. Ellie's breath caught. It was Lily. Relief flooded her for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by suspicion. "How did you get in?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "I came through the back door. It was open. Are you okay?" Lily's face appeared in the attic doorway, her expression a mix of worry and confusion. Ellie nodded, though her hands trembled as she tucked the photo into her pocket. "I thought I heard someone up here," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm glad it's just you." Lily hesitated. "Ellie, this is starting to feel dangerous. You need to be careful. Whoever doesn't want you uncovering Maggie's past might stop at nothing." Ellie swallowed hard. "I can't stop now, Lily. I have to know the truth. But I need to find out more about this Daniel." Lily looked around the attic, her gaze lingering on the boxes of old photographs and papers. "Then let's start here. If there's anything else Maggie left behind, we'll find it. What if the pastor uncovering was never meant to be found?" As Ellie and Lily combed through the attic, Ellie found an old tin box buried beneath a stack of blankets. Inside were faded letters, their edges yellowed with age. Ellie opened one, her fingers trembling. The letter was addressed to Maggie Montgomery and was signed by none other than Richard Montgomery himself. "Ellie," Lily said, her voice low and urgent. "This might be what you're looking for." Ellie read aloud. "Margaret, I've done what I can to protect you and Daniel, but you have to leave. The estate isn't safe anymore. They know too much. If you stay, it will destroy everything." Her voice broke as she read the next line. "Promise me, Margaret, you won't let them use Daniel against us." Ellie's blood ran cold. What had Maggie been running from? And who were they? What if the danger isn't just in the past? As they packed up the letters, Lily glanced out the attic window and froze. "Ellie," she whispered, "I think someone's outside." Ellie joined her at the window, her heart sinking as she saw the same man in the dark coat standing by the edge of the woods. "He's been following me," Ellie murmured, dread pooling in her stomach. "We need to call the police," Lily said, but Ellie shook her head. "And tell them what? That I'm being followed because of a decades-old mystery? They'll think I'm crazy." Lily grabbed Ellie's arm. "This isn't a game, Ellie. Whoever he is, he doesn't look like he's just here to chat." But as quickly as he'd appeared, the man melted into the shadows, leaving Ellie with more questions than answers. What if the warnings are closer than you think? Later that evening, Ellie locked herself in her room and spread the letters across her bed. She reread Richard's words, looking for clues she might have missed. Then she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint watermark on one of the letters. She held it up to the light and gasped. The watermark wasn't just a design, it was a map. Tiny, intricate lines formed what looked like a layout of the Montgomery estate. Why would Richard hide this in a letter? Ellie whispered. Her mind raced. Was this a map of where they had hidden something? Or was it a warning about where not to go? But before Ellie could think further, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, Ellie. This won't end well for you. What if the person you trust the most knows more than they're saying?" Ellie stared at the message, her hands shaking. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. Who was watching her, and how did they know what she was doing? As she stared at her phone, her father knocked on her door. "Ellie, can we talk?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. Ellie hesitated, the photograph of Daniel still in her pocket. "Sure," she said cautiously. Her father stepped inside, his face lined with worry. "I know you've been looking into Maggie's past, and I think it's time you know the truth." Ellie's heart pounded as she waited for him to continue. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. What could she possibly say to justify the web of lies? How could this tangled mess of betrayals ever lead to answers, let alone redemption? The room felt colder than before, the walls of secrets closing in tighter with every passing second. Ethan sat across from Grandma Margaret, his hands trembling on the table. Across from him, her expression shifted between guilt and defiance, as if she couldn't decide whether to crumble under the weight of her misdeeds or lash out in defense of her actions. But what defense could possibly excuse the unforgivable? "Do you really think you can explain this away, Grandma?" Ethan's voice cut through the silence, sharper than the shards of his broken trust. He didn't even recognize the tone coming from his own throat anymore. "Sleeping with Dad, with Daniel, and now the neighbor's father? What are you even going to say?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, her weary eyes scanning Ethan, searching for an opening. But instead of answering, she asked a question of her own. "Why do you think I did it, Ethan? Don't you wonder what drove me to make such unthinkable choices?" Her words slithered into Ethan's mind like a poisonous whisper. What drove her? No, he didn't want to entertain that thought. Was she about to twist the blame back on him, on their family, on his late mother? And yet, the very question forced him to stay, his curiosity outweighing his fury. "You want me to ask why you ruined our lives?" Ethan spat, his chair scraping against the wooden floor as he leaned forward. "Fine. Why? Was it revenge? Power? Or are you just a monster who enjoys destroying everything in her path?" Margaret's face darkened, her wrinkles deepening with what looked like years of suppressed emotion. She sighed, but it wasn't a sigh of guilt or apology. It was something colder, something calculated. "If I'm a monster, Ethan, this family made me one." His breath caught in his throat. What did she mean by that? What secrets was she about to unravel now? The room seemed to shift under the weight of her words, the shadows on the walls creeping closer, as if they too wanted to hear her answer. Margaret began to speak, her voice low and deliberate. "Your grandfather wasn't the saint everyone thought he was. He had affairs. He lied. He manipulated me, your mother, and countless others. Do you know how it feels to live in the shadow of a man like that? To be dismissed and humiliated for decades? You don't know what that kind of pain does to a person." Ethan shook his head. unwilling to let her rewrite the narrative so easily. "So what, Grandma? That's your excuse? You're saying you cheated on your own family because Grandpa did it first? That's disgusting." But Margaret wasn't done. Her tone hardened, her words slicing through the air like daggers. "It wasn't just about him, Ethan. This family has been broken for generations. Your mother knew things she never told you. Secrets she took to her grave. And you think I'm a villain here? You don't even know half the story." Her words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. What did she mean about his mother? His mother had always been the moral compass of their family, the one who kept everyone grounded. Was Margaret seriously suggesting she had skeletons in her closet too? "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking with both anger and fear. "What secrets? What did Mom know?" Margaret stared at him, her silence dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you really want to know, Ethan? Because once I tell you, there's no going back. You think you're angry now. Wait until you learn the truth." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave this twisted conversation behind and never look back. But another part, the part that needed answers, no matter how painful, kept him rooted to his seat. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I need to know." Margaret's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "Your mother wasn't as innocent as you think. She had her own affair before you were even born. And it wasn't just some fling, Ethan. It was with someone you know very well." Ethan's mind raced, a dozen names flashing through his head. Who? His father's best friend? The neighbor? No, it couldn't be. And yet, the way Margaret was looking at him, as if she was waiting for him to figure it out on his own, made him feel like the truth was right in front of him, just out of reach. "Stop playing games," he snapped. "Who was it?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then said the name that shattered what little was left of Ethan's world. "Daniel's father," she said, her voice heavy with both regret and defiance. "Your mother was with Daniel's father." The room spun around Ethan. He felt like he couldn't breathe. This couldn't be real. His mother, the woman he had idolized his entire life, had been involved with the father of the man he once considered a friend? And what did that mean for him? For his family? "Are you saying—" His voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Margaret nodded. "That's right, Ethan. There's a chance Daniel isn't just your childhood friend. He might be your brother." The revelation hit Ethan like a freight train. He pushed back from the table, his chair toppling over as he stumbled to his feet. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You're lying. You have to be lying." But Margaret didn't flinch. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. "You wanted the truth," she said simply. "And now you have it." Ethan turned and stormed out of the room, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, confusion, betrayal. He didn't know where to go or what to do. All he knew was that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. What other secrets is she hiding? And how much more of the truth can I handle before it breaks me completely? How much pain can a single heart endure? How many secrets can one family hide before they consume everything in their path? As I sat in the dimly lit room, replaying the shocking revelations that had unraveled my life, a new question gnawed at my mind. If Grandma could betray us so deeply, who else in this family could be hiding such vile secrets? The night felt heavier than usual, suffocating in its silence. I couldn't bring myself to face my husband after what I had learned. Every glance in his direction was a painful reminder of his involvement with the woman I once called my guiding light. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Was my husband truly the man I thought I knew, or was he just another pawn in Grandma's twisted game? In that stillness, I noticed something odd, a faint glimmer beneath the bedroom door. It was nearly midnight, and the light from the hallway cast eerie shadows across the floor. My curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed out of the room. My instinct screamed for me to turn back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I crept closer to the kitchen, muffled voices caught my attention. At first, I couldn't make out who was speaking, but the urgency in their tones sent my pulse racing. Who could be awake at this hour? And what were they whispering about so frantically? Pressing my ear to the wall, I strained to make out the words. "She knows too much already," a deep voice growled. "If this gets out, it will destroy everything." Another voice responded, barely above a whisper, but trembling with fear. "But what if she finds the letters? Those letters could ruin us all." Letters? My heart skipped a beat. What letters? And who were they talking about, me? I peered around the corner to see my father standing with Grandma, their faces pale and anxious. Their body language betrayed a level of desperation I had never seen before. As I watched, Grandma slammed a stack of envelopes onto the table, her voice rising in anger. "You think I don't know how to handle this? I've been covering for you for years. You're the one who got sloppy." My breath caught in my throat. Covering for him? What did she mean? And what had my father done that required her protection? Every fiber of my being urged me to burst into the room and demand answers, but fear rooted me in place. The conversation shifted, and Grandma's tone turned cold, calculating. "She'll never find them. Those letters are buried where no one would think to look. But if she keeps digging, well, we may have to silence her for good." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Were they talking about me? Was my own family plotting to harm me? Suddenly, memories from my childhood flooded back in fragments. Moments that had always seemed odd but harmless. The locked drawer in Grandma's room. The whispered arguments between my parents late at night. The way my father's face would darken whenever certain names were mentioned. Had all these years been a lie? Was the image of my perfect family nothing more than an elaborate facade? I clutched the wall for support, feeling as though the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had held my hand during thunderstorms, was he just another villain in this twisted narrative? Or was he a victim, trapped in Grandma's manipulative web like the rest of us? My mind swirled with questions that refused to settle. What were those letters? Why were they so dangerous? And if Grandma had been covering for my father, what was his role in all of this? The answers felt just out of reach, tantalizing and terrifying all at once. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to confront them. But as I stepped into the room, the conversation abruptly stopped. Their eyes turned to me, wide with a mix of shock and something darker, fear. "Couldn't sleep?" Grandma asked, her voice smooth, but her eyes sharp. She quickly slid the letters off the table and into a drawer, locking it with a single, deliberate motion. My father avoided my gaze, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up his coffee cup. I forced a smile, masking the storm of emotions brewing inside me. "I thought I heard voices," I said casually, pretending not to notice the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Is everything okay?" Grandma's lips curled into a tight smile. "Of course, dear. Just a late-night chat about old times." But I wasn't fooled. Their strained expressions, the sweat on my father's brow, the way Grandma's hand lingered protectively over the drawer, it all screamed that something was terribly wrong. And as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the corner of an envelope sticking out from the drawer. My heart raced as I realized I needed to find out what was in those letters. Whatever secrets they held, they were worth hiding at all costs. But the question that haunted me as I walked away was this: what price would I have to pay to uncover the truth? Have you ever felt the weight of a secret so immense it seemed to suffocate the air around you? As the morning sunlight crept into the house, illuminating the shadows of the night before, one question loomed over me like a dark cloud. What exactly are they hiding, and how far are they willing to go to keep it buried? The locked drawer from the night before wouldn't leave my mind. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a nagging reminder that something monumental lay just out of my reach. But how could I get to it without arousing suspicion? Grandma was sharp, calculating, and always one step ahead. My father, on the other hand, seemed like a man unraveling under the weight of his guilt. Could I exploit that? Would he crack under pressure if I pushed him hard enough? I decided to test the waters during breakfast. The table was unusually quiet, the tension between Grandma and my father palpable. My husband sat next to me, oblivious as ever, scrolling through his phone. I broke the silence with a casual question, one that I hoped would land like a bombshell. "Grandma," I began, feigning nonchalance, "do you still keep those old letters from Grandpa? The ones he wrote during the war?" Her hand froze mid-reach for the sugar bowl. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped, and I saw panic flash in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, offering me a tight smile. "Oh, those old things. I haven't looked at them in years." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, pretending not to notice her reaction. "I was just curious. It must be nice to have those memories to hold on to." Grandma's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Memories are a funny thing, dear. Some are better left undisturbed." Her words sent a chill down my spine. What memories was she hiding? And why was she so desperate to keep them buried? Later that day, when the house was quiet and everyone was preoccupied, I decided to act. The locked drawer in the kitchen was my target, but I needed a plan. I rummaged through Grandma's room, searching for a key or any clue that might help me. My heart raced as I sifted through her belongings, each drawer and cabinet feeling like a treasure chest of secrets. Amid the chaos, I stumbled upon an old photo album tucked away in a dusty corner. The cover was worn, and the pages smelled of age, but it was what lay inside that stopped me cold. There were photos of Grandma with a man I didn't recognize, smiling, laughing, holding hands. He wasn't my grandfather. Who was he? And what role did he play in her life? In the margins of one photo, someone had scrawled a name. Henry. The name meant nothing to me, but the intimacy in the picture suggested he had meant everything to her. Has Grandma been unfaithful to Grandpa? Was this the secret she had been hiding all these years? I couldn't shake the question swirling in my mind. Was Henry the reason for her manipulative behavior? Did my father know about him? And could these letters they were so desperate to hide have something to do with this man? Returning to the kitchen, I examined the locked drawer. It was an old, sturdy piece of furniture with a brass lock that seemed impossible to pick. Frustrated, I paced the room, my mind racing. Then I remembered something, the spare keys. Grandma always kept them in a small wooden box in the pantry. My hands trembled as I opened the box, and there it was, a small, brass key. Was this it? Was this the key to unlocking the secrets that could shatter my world even further? The key fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the drawer slid open. My breath caught as I took in the contents. A stack of envelopes tied together with a fraying ribbon, a few black and white photos, and a faded journal. My fingers hovered over the letters, hesitant to disturb them. Was I ready to confront whatever truths lay within? I picked up the top envelope, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant, almost lyrical, and the words sent shivers down my spine. "Dearest Margaret, my heart aches every moment we are apart. I dream of the day we can be together without fear or shame." Margaret! Grandma's real name. Who had written this? And what fear or shame were they referring to? I barely had time to process the letter before I heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to close the drawer and return the key to its place. I clutched the letter to my chest, unable to let it go. The footsteps grew louder, and I realized too late that I had left the drawer slightly ajar. Grandma appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with unspoken accusations. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice cold and menacing. I didn't answer. My heart pounded as she stepped closer, her gaze dropping to the letter in my hand. Her expression hardened, and her voice dropped to a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "You've opened a door you can't close, my dear. Are you sure you're ready for what's on the other side?" The letter burned in my hands like a forbidden artifact. Its words a key to a past I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But Grandma's cryptic warning only fueled my determination. What door had I opened? And what horrors awaited me on the other side? I had to know, no matter the cost. What would you do if every step forward felt like a descent into something darker, something you were never meant to know? As I held the faded letter in my trembling hands, one question consumed me. Who is this man to Grandma, and what could he possibly mean to our family's tangled web of secrets? I sat in the quiet of my bedroom, the door locked, the world outside muted. With every word of the letter, my chest tightened. The man who wrote it, Henry, spoke of a love that was fierce, forbidden, and intoxicating. Margaret, my darling, I dream of the day we can escape this charade. Your world and mine, they don't belong together, but I can't stay away. I can't live knowing that you're in his arms when it's me you love. Escape this charade? My mind raced. Was Henry referring to my grandfather? Had Grandma been living a double life even back then? And if she had, what did that mean for everything I thought I knew about my family? The letter ended with a chilling postscript. If he finds out, it will destroy us both. Destroy them both. Who was he? My grandfather? Someone else entirely? And what exactly did Henry mean by find out? My thoughts spiraled as I tried to connect the dots. I placed the letter aside and reached for the stack of photos I had taken from the drawer. They were black and white, capturing moments frozen in time. One photo stood out. Grandma, younger and radiant, standing next to a man with piercing eyes and a confident smile. It had to be Henry. The way he looked at her, even in the photograph, was unmistakable. He adored her. But why had Grandma kept these photos and letters all these years? And why had she hidden them so carefully? Was it guilt? Regret? Or was there something even more sinister at play? As I pieced through the fragments of their correspondence, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Henry wasn't just a lover. He was a shadow that lingered over Grandma's life, long after he was gone. His letters spoke of secret meetings, whispered promises, and plans to flee together. I can't bear to see you with him, Margaret. He doesn't deserve you. I'll wait for you at the cabin by the lake. Come to me, and we'll start over. The cabin by the lake. The words tugged at a memory buried deep in my mind. I had heard my father mention a cabin once, years ago. He had described it as off-limits, a place we were never to visit. Was this the same place? And if it was, what had happened there? The more I read, the more I realized that Henry wasn't just a fleeting chapter in Grandma's life. He was central to her story. But what had happened to him? Why had their plans to escape never come to fruition? And why had Grandma chosen to stay with my grandfather instead of pursuing the love she so clearly felt for Henry? The answers weren't in the letters. They were somewhere else, locked away in Grandma's mind, or perhaps in the secrets she had carefully hidden in this house. I needed to confront her, to demand the truth. But how could I do that without exposing myself? She already suspected me of prying, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to protect her secrets at any cost. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of what I had discovered pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. I decided to get some fresh air, hoping the cool night breeze would clear my head. Backslash. As I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Grandma's door was ajar, and a faint light spilled into the dark corridor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer. Inside, Grandma sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. She was holding something, a photograph. It was one of the pictures I had taken from the drawer earlier. My heart raced as I realized what this meant. She knew. Somehow, she had discovered what I had done. "Why are you up so late?" Her voice cut through the silence, sharp and accusing. I stepped into the room, my mind scrambling for an excuse. "I couldn't sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What about you?" She placed the photo down and turned to face me. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, were cold and calculating. "Sometimes the past keeps us awake," she said. Don't you agree?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. Did she know how much of her past I had uncovered? Was this a warning? Or was she simply testing me, waiting for me to confess? As I left her room, her words echoed in my mind. The past keeps us awake. What did she mean by that? Was it a threat, a confession, or something else entirely? I didn't have answers, only more questions. Back in my room, I clutched the letter and photos to my chest, determined to uncover the full truth. But as the night stretched on, one thought consumed me. How far would Grandma go to keep her secrets buried? And what would happen to me if I dug too deep? The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was darker than I could have imagined. Henry's name, the cabin by the lake, and Grandma's cryptic warnings, they were all connected. But how? And why did it feel like I was on the brink of discovering something that could destroy everything? The answers were out there, and I was determined to find them, no matter the cost. Have you ever wondered why certain places are forbidden? Their very mention cloaked in secrecy? What could be hidden in a place so off-limits that its mere existence is barely acknowledged? As I stared at the letters and photos sprawled across my desk, one name burned in my mind. The cabin by the lake. But what lay waiting there? And was I ready to find out? The cabin wasn't just a place mentioned in Henry's letters. It was a thread pulling me closer to something terrifyingly real. Every detail he wrote about their plans to escape, their whispered moments in that secluded spot, painted the cabin as the epicenter of their forbidden love. But why had no one in my family ever spoken of it, except for my father's cryptic warning to stay away? I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin held more than just memories. It held answers. Answers to questions I wasn't sure I wanted to ask, but couldn't stop myself from pursuing. That morning, I decided to confront my father. If anyone knew about the cabin, it was him. But how could I ask without revealing what I knew? I approached him in the kitchen, where he stood sipping his coffee, the morning light casting a warm glow over his otherwise stern features. "Dad," I began cautiously, "do you remember that cabin you mentioned a long time ago? The one by the lake?" His hand froze midair, the coffee mug trembling slightly. His eyes narrowed as he looked at me, suspicion flickering across his face. "Why are you asking about that?" he said, his voice low and guarded. I came across some old letters," I admitted, carefully choosing my words. "They mentioned the cabin. I was curious." His expression darkened, and for a moment I thought he might lash out. But instead he set his mug down and let out a heavy sigh. "That place is nothing but trouble," he said. "It's better left in the past." "But why?" I pressed. "What happened there?" He shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Some things are better left buried." "Forget about it." His refusal only fueled my determination. That night, while everyone else slept, I packed a flashlight and a jacket and snuck out of the house. The directions to the cabin were vague, but I pieced them together from Henry's letters and fragments of my father's stories. The journey was eerie, the forest surrounding the lake shrouded in mist. The crunch of leaves beneath my feet was the only sound, each step amplifying my unease. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle in the bushes a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw no one. When I finally reached the cabin, it was nothing like I'd imagined. It was small, weathered, and abandoned, its wooden frame barely standing against the weight of time. But there was something about it, a lingering energy that made the air feel heavier, the silence oppressive. Pushing open the creaking door, I stepped inside. The air was stale, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Dust-covered furniture was scattered haphazardly, as if whoever had last been here had left in a hurry. On the table lay a few yellowed papers and an old photograph. My breath caught as I recognized Grandma's youthful face, her eyes full of a happiness I'd never seen in her before. Beside her was Henry, his arm around her shoulder. The photograph wasn't the only thing on the table. There was a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. I flipped through its pages. my heart racing as I read Henry's words. The journal detailed their plans to elope, their fears of being discovered, and their love for each other. But it didn't end there. One entry stood out. Margaret says we can't keep this up. She says it's too dangerous, but I can't let her go. I'll meet her here tomorrow night and convince her. I have to... But there were no entries after that. What had happened that night? Had they argued? Had something gone wrong? The silence in the journal was deafening, its lack of answers only raising more questions. As I pored over the journal, I heard a sound, a faint creak, like footsteps on the porch. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't alone. I quickly turned off my flashlight and crouched behind a piece of furniture, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The dim moonlight streaming through the broken windows revealed a silhouette, tall, imposing, and eerily familiar. My breath caught as I recognized the figure. Grandma! What was she doing here? How had she known I would come? And more importantly, what was she hiding? "Come out," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I know you're here." I stayed silent, my mind racing. Did she know what I had found? Was she here to confront me or to destroy the evidence? My hands trembled as I clutched the journal tighter, unsure of what to do. Grandma moved further into the cabin, her eyes scanning the room. "You think you're uncovering the truth," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But you don't even know what you're looking for." Her words sent a chill down my spine. What did she mean? What truths were still hidden? And why did it feel like I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than I could have imagined? As she turned her back to me, I saw my chance. Clutching the journal, I slipped out of the cabin and ran into the woods, her voice echoing behind me. "You can't run from this forever." What was Grandma hiding in the cabin? Why had she followed me? And what truths was she so desperate to protect? As I ran through the dark forest, one thing was clear. I was no longer just uncovering secrets. I was now a part of them. Have you ever felt that the answers you've sought are far more terrifying than the questions? As I clutched Henry's journal tightly against my chest, one thought raced through my mind. Why was Grandma so desperate to stop me? What was buried in these pages that she didn't want me to uncover? And more importantly, who else knew? The forest seemed darker than before, as if it were closing in on me with each step I took. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam barely illuminating the path ahead. Behind me, I could still hear the faint crunch of leaves, a sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. Was she following me, or was it something else entirely? Every few moments, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting Grandma's shadowy figure to emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, only the suffocating silence of the woods and the distant call of an owl. My mind churned with questions. Why was she there? How had she known I would be at the cabin? And most importantly, what would she do to keep her secrets buried? When I finally reached the safety of my room, I locked the door and turned my attention to the journal. The entries were fragmented, written in hurried scrawls, but each page felt like a breadcrumb leading me deeper into the labyrinth of their lives. One entry stood out. "Margaret says someone is watching us. She's scared, and I don't blame her. This isn't just about us anymore. If they find out, everything will fall apart." Someone was watching them? Who? And why? Was this the reason Grandma had become so secretive, so controlling? The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together yet, but I was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. As I pored over the journal, a knock at my door shattered the silence. My heart leapt into my throat. Who could it be at this hour? For a brief moment, I considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, louder, more insistent. "Open up," came a familiar voice. It was my father. I hesitated, hiding the journal beneath my pillow before unlocking the door. His face was stern, his eyes searching mine as if he already knew what I'd done. "Where were you tonight?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I went for a walk," I stammered, my pulse quickening. "Why?" He stepped closer, his presence towering. "Don't lie to me. Did you go to the cabin?" I froze. How did he know? My silence must have given me away, because his expression darkened. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Stay away from that place. And whatever you found there, forget it." "But why?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. "What's so dangerous about the truth?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "Some truths destroy everything," he said, "and some people will do anything to protect them." After he left, I couldn't sleep. His warning echoed in my mind, mingling with Grandma's cryptic words. The two people I trusted most in the world were now the ones I feared. What were they hiding? And why did it feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into an abyss I couldn't climb out of? I returned to the journal, flipping through its pages until I found another entry. "Margaret says she wants to end this, but I know she doesn't mean it. She's just scared. We both are. But I have a plan, one that will make everything right." What plan? Had they gone through with it? And if they had, why did it feel like the consequences were still rippling through our family? The next day, I decided to confront Grandma. She was in the garden, her hands busy pruning roses that seemed to thrive under her meticulous care. The sight of her, so calm and composed, only made my anger simmer. "Grandma," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance, "why were you at the cabin last night?" She didn't look up, her focus remaining on the roses. "You shouldn't have gone there," she said simply. "Some places are meant to be forgotten in." But I didn't forget. I shot back. "I found Henry's journal. I know about the cabin, about the plans you two made. Why are you hiding this?" Her hands paused, the pruning shears trembling slightly. For a moment, I thought she might deny it. But instead, she turned to face me. Her expression was a mix of sorrow and resolve. "You think you know the truth," she said softly, "but you don't. And if you keep digging, you'll wish you never started." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. As I stared at her, I realized something chilling. The calm exterior she wore was a mask, hiding a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to understand. "What happened to Henry?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, I saw something that looked like guilt, or was it fear? "Some questions," she said, her voice trembling, "don't have answers you're ready to hear." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than ever. What was she so afraid of? What truths lay buried in the past? And most importantly, who was I really dealing with? As I stood in the garden, watching Grandma's retreating figure, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about her and Henry. The secret she was hiding went deeper, entangling my entire family in a web of lies and betrayal that was far from over. What would I uncover next? And would I survive knowing the truth? What happens when every piece of the puzzle you uncover reveals an even darker corner of the truth? Just when I thought I was getting closer to understanding the tangled web of lies surrounding Grandma, Henry, and my family, something shifted. A new clue, a fresh betrayal. The question that haunted me wasn't just what happened, but how far would they go to keep it buried? The day began with a letter, one that wasn't supposed to reach me. It was slipped under my door in the dead of night, its presence both chilling and surreal. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. Written in jagged, hurried handwriting were the words, "Stop digging before you uncover something you can't handle." Who had sent this? My first thought was Grandma, but the handwriting didn't match hers. Was it my father, desperate to keep me in the dark? Or was there someone else? Another player in this twisted game, lurking in the shadows? The letter wasn't signed, but there was one clue. A faint watermark at the bottom of the page. It was the outline of a lake, eerily similar to the one where the cabin stood. My mind raced. The cabin wasn't just the site of forbidden love. It was the epicenter of something far more sinister. Determined to find answers, I decided to confront Grandma again. This time, I wasn't going to let her deflect. As she sat in the living room, sipping tea with an air of practiced calm, I stood before her with the letter in hand. "Did you send this?" I demanded, holding the paper out for her to see. Her eyes flicked to the letter, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her composure. She didn't answer immediately, which only fueled my suspicion. "No," she finally said, her voice low and measured. "But I know who did." My breath caught. "Who?" I asked, leaning in closer. She set her teacup down with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. "You don't want to know," she said. "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." Her response wasn't just cryptic, it was a warning. But the way she avoided my gaze told me there was more to the story. Much more. Later that evening, as I replayed her words in my mind, I heard the faint sound of footsteps above me. Curious and uneasy, I followed the sound to the attic, where I found my father rummaging through old boxes. He seemed startled when he saw me, quickly hiding something behind his back. "What are you doing up here?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "Looking for something," he replied, his tone defensive. I crossed my arms. "What are you hiding?" He sighed, then reluctantly revealed what he'd been clutching. An old key, tarnished with age. "It's for the basement," he said. "I thought I'd lost it years ago." The basement, the one place in the house Grandma had always forbidden me from entering. Why did he have the key now? And why did it feel like he didn't want me to know? When my father left for the evening, I knew what I had to do. Armed with the key, I made my way to the basement door. The air grew colder as I descended the creaking wooden steps, each one echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. The faint scent of damp earth and mildew filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and forgotten relics of the past, but one thing stood out. A trunk in the corner, its lid slightly ajar. My heart raced as I approached it, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity won. Inside the trunk were photographs, dozens of them. They were of Grandma and Henry, but not in the loving, carefree moments I'd imagined. In these photos, they looked tense, their eyes darting to the camera as if caught off guard. Some of the photos were torn, as if someone had tried to erase certain faces from the narrative. And then I saw it, a letter folded neatly beneath the photographs. It was addressed to Henry, but the handwriting was unmistakably Grandma's. The words sent chills down my spine. "If you don't end this, I will. You're putting everything at risk." My hands trembled as I held the letter. What did she mean by "end this"? Had Grandma issued an ultimatum? And what risk was so great that it required such drastic measures? My mind reeled with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Before I could process it further, the basement door creaked open behind me. I froze, the letter still in my hand. Slowly, I turned to see a shadow descending the stairs. "Found what you were looking for." Grandma's voice cut through the silence, cold and sharp. Her figure loomed at the bottom of the steps, her eyes locked on the letter in my hand. There was no warmth in her gaze, no trace of the woman I thought I knew. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just unraveling her secrets. I was stepping into her world, and it was a world where curiosity wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. As the basement seemed to grow darker around us, one thing was clear. I wasn't leaving without answers. But the real question was, would I leave at all? What had Grandma done to protect her secrets? And what would she do to stop me from uncovering the rest? What would you do if you realized the person you trusted most had been guarding the darkest secrets of your life? How do you face someone who looks at you not with regret, but with cold determination to protect what they've hidden? As Grandma stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, her shadow stretching across the dimly lit room, the question wasn't whether I'd find the truth. It was whether I'd survive it. "Put the letter down," Grandma commanded, her voice firm but eerily calm. I froze, clutching the paper as if it were my only lifeline. My heart raced as I met her gaze, the flicker of a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. "What does this mean, Grandma?" I asked, holding the letter up. "What risk were you talking about?" Her silence was deafening. She stepped closer, each movement deliberate, her footsteps echoing in the cold, damp basement. "There are things you don't understand," she said finally, "and you're better off that way." "But why?" I pressed, my voice trembling. "Why go to such lengths? Why lie to all of us?" She sighed, the weight of decades seemingly pressing down on her. "Some truths destroy families," she said, "and some truths destroy lives." Before I could respond, her eyes darted toward the trunk I had just rifled through. Her composure faltered for the briefest moment. "What else did you find?" she demanded. "Just old photos," I lied, tucking the letter into my pocket. But my words only seemed to fuel her suspicion. She moved past me with surprising speed, her hands diving into the trunk and pulling out a worn leather album I hadn't noticed before. She clutched the album tightly, her knuckles white. "You should have never come down here," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "What's in that album?" I asked, my voice rising with equal parts fear and anger. "What are you hiding?" Her eyes burned into mine, and for a moment I thought she might actually tell me, but instead she turned away, clutching the album like a shield. "Some memories are better left buried," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Later that night, the confrontation left me shaken. Every interaction with Grandma seemed to leave me with more questions than answers. I couldn't sleep, the words from the letter replaying in my mind. "You're putting everything at risk." I decided to call Henry. If anyone could help piece together this puzzle, it was him. But when I dialed his number, the line went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but there was no answer. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Where was he? I sent him a text, desperate for a response. "Henry, I found something. I need to talk to you. It's urgent." Minutes passed, then an hour, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Was he ignoring me? Or was something else going on? The unanswered text felt like another piece of the mystery, taunting me with its emptiness. The next morning, unable to shake the dread, I drove to Henry's house. His car was in the driveway, but the windows were dark, the curtains drawn. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. There was no answer. "Henry!" I called, pressing my ear to the door. Nothing. I circled around to the backyard, peering through the windows. It was then I noticed something strange. A glass of wine on the counter, still half full, and a chair tipped over near the dining table. The scene felt frozen in time, like someone had left in a hurry or been forced to leave. Panic surged through me. I called his name again, louder this time. When there was still no response, I dialed 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation. The police arrived quickly, their presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. They broke down the door, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit house. I followed closely behind, my heart racing with every step. The house was eerily silent. The officers searched each room, their movements methodical. It wasn't until they reached the basement that they stopped abruptly. One of them called out, "We found something." I held my breath as they descended the stairs. When I followed, the sight that greeted me was both shocking and surreal. Henry was there, slumped against the wall, unconscious but alive. His wrists were bound, and his face bore the marks of a struggle. "Henry!" I cried, rushing to his side. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at me with a mix of relief and fear. "You have to stop," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "She'll do anything to protect her secrets." Before I could ask him what he meant, the officers escorted him to safety. I watched as they led him out of the house, his words echoing in my mind. "She'll do anything to protect her secrets." Who was he talking about? Grandma? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? As I stood alone in the basement, a faint sound caught my attention, the creak of a floorboard above me. My blood ran cold. Was someone still in the house? And if so, were they watching me? I looked up at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The only question now was, how much more was I willing to risk to uncover the truth? Just when I thought I'd reached the heart of the mystery, another layer revealed itself. Who had bound Henry? And what were they trying to protect? The answers were closer than ever, but so was the danger. Could I keep going without losing myself in the process, or was I already too far gone? What do you do when every step forward feels like sinking deeper into a trap? Every answer I uncovered only raised more questions, like peeling back layers of a rotting onion. As I sat by Henry's hospital bed, his whispered warnings replayed in my mind. Who was she, and what lengths had she gone to protect her secrets? The hospital room was dimly lit, a faint beep from the heart monitor filling the silence. Henry looked pale, his face bruised but his eyes sharp. "You don't understand," he began, his voice raspy. "This isn't just about your grandmother. There's more." "More," I echoed, leaning closer. "What do you mean, Henry? Who's behind this?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door as if someone might burst in at any moment. "Your grandmother isn't acting alone," he said finally. "There's someone else, someone who's been pulling the strings for years." The weight of his words pressed down on me. Another person? Another layer to this nightmare? "Who?" I demanded. "Who's helping her?" Henry's hand gripped mine weakly. "You don't want to know," he whispered. "Because once you know, there's no going back." Later that evening, as I sat in my car outside the hospital, my phone buzzed. An email from an unknown sender had landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "For your eyes only." My stomach churned as I hesitated before opening it. The email contained a single attachment, a scanned letter, handwritten in a shaky script. It was addressed to Grandma, and it read, "Margaret, the walls are closing in. You know what you have to do. No one can ever find out. We're both in too deep. Burn this after reading." There was no signature, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. My mind raced. Who had written this? And how had it ended up in my inbox? Was someone trying to help me, or was this another trap? I drove home in a daze, the letter replaying in my mind like a haunting melody. But as I pulled into the driveway, my headlights illuminated a figure standing on the porch. It was Grandma. My pulse quickened. Why was she here? And how long had she been waiting? "You've been digging where you don't belong," she said as I approached. Her tone was calm, but her eyes burned with intensity. "You're putting yourself in danger." "Danger!" I shot back, clutching my phone tightly. "From who, Grandma?" "From you." Her expression darkened, and for a moment I thought she might actually admit to everything. But instead, she said, "I came to warn you. There are things you don't understand. Things that could destroy you." "I'm not afraid of the truth," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "I just want to know what you've been hiding." Her gaze softened, but it was filled with a strange sadness. "The truth," she murmured, "has a way of tearing people apart." After Grandma left, her cryptic words lingering in the air, I knew I couldn't sit idly by. I needed answers, and I needed them now. My mind drifted back to the basement, to the locked trunk and the hidden album. What else was down there? What hadn't I found? Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I descended the stairs into the basement. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that seemed to hold its breath. I moved toward the trunk, prying it open with more force than necessary. Inside, beneath the album I had seen earlier, was a false bottom. I lifted the panel to reveal a stack of envelopes, each one labeled with a different name. My father's name was on one. My husband's name was on another. And then, to my shock, there was a third envelope with my name on it. My hands shook as I opened the envelope with my name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and as I read the words, my blood ran cold. "You think you're safe, but you're not. Everything you thought you knew is a lie. Your father's mistakes were just the beginning, and your husband is no saint either. If you keep digging, you'll find yourself buried alongside the truth. The letter wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting. It was Grandma's. My heart raced as I tried to process the implications. She knew I was searching for answers. She knew I had uncovered pieces of the puzzle. But how far was she willing to go to stop me? As I stood there, clutching the letter, I heard the faintest sound. A creak from the floorboards above me. Someone was in the house. My breath caught as I turned off the flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. Who was it? Grandma? Or someone else entirely? And why were they here? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I stayed frozen, listening as the footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs one deliberate step at a time. Whoever it was, they were coming for me. Just when I thought I had uncovered the deepest secrets, a new threat emerged. Who was in the house? And what were they willing to do to protect the truth? The answers were closer than ever, but so was the danger. Would I find the courage to face what was coming? Or had I already gone too far? What do you do when the walls of your own home begin to whisper secrets you're not prepared to hear? As I stood frozen in the pitch-black basement, the sound of deliberate, heavy footsteps descending the stairs above me sent a cold shiver down my spine. Who is it? And how had they slipped in unnoticed? Was it Grandma? Or had I stirred something far more dangerous? The creaking of the wooden steps was agonizingly slow, each sound echoing in a confined basement like a death knell. My grip on the flashlight tightened, but I didn't dare turn it back on. Darkness was my only ally now. My breath caught in my throat as I counted each step. 5, 6, 7. Whoever it was had stopped just before reaching the bottom. I strained my ears to catch any movement, any hint of their intentions. Then came the voice, a low, familiar murmur that sent chills down my spine. Why couldn't you leave it alone? It was Grandma, but her voice was different, calm, measured, and terrifyingly controlled. She wasn't here to warn me this time. She was here for something else entirely. You've seen too much, she said, her silhouette barely visible against a faint glow from the basement window. You think you're clever, but you've only scratched the surface. What are you hiding? I demanded, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound brave. What are all these letters, Grandma? Why are our names on them? She stepped closer, her figure looming like a shadow over my crumpled resolve. The letters were supposed to be insurance, she said cryptically, but you've turned them into a liability. Insurance for what? I pressed, my heart pounding. And against who? Her lips curled into a cold smile. You think you've uncovered betrayal, but you're just scratching at the edges of survival. Sometimes love is war and family is a battlefield. Her words were laced with something deeper, something that hinted at a darkness I hadn't yet comprehended. What does that mean? I asked, desperation creeping into my tone. It means you're playing a game you don't understand, she replied. And if you keep pushing, you'll regret it. I felt the heat of anger rising in me, burning away the fear. No, I said, stepping forward. I'm done being scared. You don't get to threaten me and call it love. You don't get to destroy our family and call it survival. I want the truth, Grandma, all of it. For a moment, she looked taken aback, but then her expression hardened. The truth, she said, her voice low and venomous, is that your father, your husband, and we've all been playing roles in a game bigger than you, and you're the one who's about to lose. What roles? What game? I demanded, the frustration boiling over. Why do you always speak in riddles? Grandma leaned closer, her face inches from mine. Because the truth, she whispered, is worse than you think. Just as I thought I couldn't feel more trapped. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an object that glinted faintly in the dim light. It was a photograph, one that seemed old, with edges worn from years of handling. She handed it to me without a word, and my heart stopped when I saw what it was. It was a picture of my wedding day, but something was wrong. My husband, standing beside me, was holding hands with someone else. "Grandma, what is this?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "It's proof," she said simply. "Proof that loyalty is a myth and love is just a tool." I couldn't process it. Was this doctored? A cruel joke? Or was it real? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more sickening than the last. The suffocating tension snapped as I shoved past her, the photograph clutched in my hand. "You're lying," I said, my voice breaking. "You're just trying to mess with my head." "Am I?" she called after me, her voice calm yet chilling. "Run if you want, but every step you take will bring you closer to the truth, and further from safety." I didn't look back as I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding like a drum. But as I reached the door, I heard her final words, spoken softly but with unmistakable intent. "You won't like what you find." I locked myself in my room, my hands trembling as I stared at the photograph. Was it real? Could my husband have been involved in Grandma's twisted games all along? And if so, how deep did this betrayal go? Every question led to another, and every answer seemed more terrifying than the last. Was I the victim of a web spun by Grandma alone, or had my entire life been orchestrated by people I trusted most? And then there was the biggest question of all. What was I going to do next? Just as I thought I was alone, a new email notification flashed on my phone. The subject line read, "You're next." My blood ran cold as I opened it, revealing a single sentence. "If you want the truth, meet me at the lake tomorrow night." Come alone. The stakes had never been higher. Who had sent the email? And why did they want me to meet them alone? Was this my chance to finally uncover the truth? Or was it a trap? One thing was certain. Whatever awaited me at the lake would change everything. What would you do if the only chance for answers came with the risk of everything? As I stood by the lake under the pale glow of the moon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a trap. Who had sent the email? Could I trust the words of someone who remained in the shadows? The lake was silent, too silent, and every ripple on its surface felt like a warning. The air was cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. The towering trees around the lake stood like silent sentinels, their shadows twisting and shifting under the moonlight. I clutched my phone tightly, the email still open on the screen. "If you want the truth, meet me at the lake tomorrow night." Come alone. But who had sent it? Was it Grandma, testing me yet again? Or someone else? A pawn in her sinister game? The lake's stillness seemed to mock me, daring me to stay, daring me to leave. Each crunch of leaves under my feet made my heart race. Was I truly alone out here, or was someone watching me? Minutes felt like hours, and just as I was beginning to think no one would show, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man tall, with a hood pulled low over his face. He stopped a few feet away, his posture calm, but his presence unnerving. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you the one who sent the email?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, tossing it to the ground between us. "You wanted the truth," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's all in there." I stared at the envelope, hesitant to pick it up. "Why should I trust you?" I asked. "For all I know, you're part of whatever game she's playing." "She didn't send me," he replied, "but she'll kill me if she finds out I'm here." The man's words sent a jolt of fear through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What does she want?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear. "Your grandma doesn't want to protect this family," he said. "She wants to control it. She's been pulling the strings for years. And everyone, your dad, your husband, even the neighbors, they've all been her pawns." My breath caught in my throat. "What are you talking about?" "My dad, my husband. What did she do to them?" The man hesitated, as though weighing how much to tell me. "She finds people's weaknesses," he said finally, "and she exploits them. Your dad's affair, your husband's secrets, they're not accidents. She orchestrated them. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why would she do that? What could she possibly gain from destroying her own family? Power, the man said simply. Control. She thrives on it, and she's not afraid to ruin lives to get what she wants. I felt a mix of anger and despair bubbling inside me. Why are you telling me this? I asked. What do you have to do with any of this? The man looked down, his shoulders slumping. Because I've been part of it too, he admitted. She roped me in years ago. I did things I'm not proud of. But now I just want out. His confession sent a chill down my spine. What kind of things? I pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Things you wouldn't forgive, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't send that email to clear my conscience. I sent it because you're the only one who can stop her. My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope, the weight of its contents feeling heavier than it should. I tore it open, pulling out a stack of photographs and documents. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. Proof of everything he'd said. Pictures of Grandma with my dad, with my husband, with people I didn't even recognize. Receipts, letters, and a list of names. She's built an empire of secrets, the man said, watching my reaction closely. If you expose her, you'll destroy her. But you'll destroy everything else too. What do you mean? I asked, my voice shaking. What happens if I expose her? He hesitated. Everyone she's manipulated. Everyone she's blackmailed, they'll go down with her. Your dad, your husband, even you. The enormity of the situation hit me like a freight train. If I exposed Grandma, I'd be exposing everyone else she had entangled in her web, including the people I loved most. But if I did nothing, she would continue to manipulate and destroy lives. What do I do? I asked, tears streaming down my face. How do I stop her without losing everything? The man's expression softened, and for the first time he seemed almost sympathetic. That's for you to decide, he said. But whatever you choose, be prepared to face the consequences. Before I could respond, the sound of snapping branches broke the silence. The man stiffened, his eyes darting toward the trees. She's here, he whispered, his voice filled with panic. You have to go. What about you? I asked, my heart racing. Don't worry about me, he said, backing away into the shadows. Just run. I didn't wait to see who, or what, was coming. Clutching the envelope to my chest, I turned and sprinted back toward the house, my mind racing with questions I couldn't yet answer. What was I going to do with the information in the envelope? Could I really expose Grandma without tearing my entire family apart? And most importantly, who had been watching us at the lake? Whatever decision I made, one thing was clear. There was no turning back. How do you live with the truth when it's this devastating? When you've uncovered so many secrets, but each one leads to a darker, more dangerous revelation. I was standing on the precipice, staring down into a chasm of uncertainty, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I should take the leap or retreat into the shadows. Who could I trust? The man at the lake had warned me, but his words were so cryptic, so filled with fear. Was I walking into a trap, or was this my only way to stop the madness? Every part of me screamed for answers, but the answers I sought would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my dad, my husband, and worst of all, Grandma, Margaret. The truth was a weapon, but did I have the strength to wield it? I couldn't avoid it any longer. The information in the envelope had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. I had to confront her. I had to confront them. Everyone who had been tangled in her web of lies. The envelope's contents weighed heavily in my hands, even though I couldn't bring myself to look at the documents for a second time. They were in my mind now, haunting me. The photographs, the letters, the receipts. Evidence that proved just how deep Grandma's control ran. But how much of it was real? How much was manipulated, twisted to fit a narrative that served her dark, insidious purpose? Could I face the consequences of exposing everything? If I tore open that door, I'd be exposing more than just Grandma's lies. I'd be pulling back the curtain on my entire family's darkest secrets. The moment I got home, I locked myself in my room, pacing. My heart raced with each passing second. I had thought that confronting Grandma in person was my way of finding clarity, of getting answers. But now I felt like I was staring into a bottomless abyss. Was she ready to let me in? Or had she anticipated my every move? Was this all part of her plan? The question gnawed at me. I couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even myself. The next morning, I woke up to the soft buzzing of my phone. A message. A single line of text from an unknown number. I know you know everything now. Meet me at the old house. It took everything in me to stop my hands from trembling. The old house. A place I hadn't visited in years. The one where Grandma had raised my dad. Where I'd spent countless holidays, unaware of the horrors lurking beneath the surface. But what was I supposed to do now? Was this her calling me to confront me? Or was it just another ploy to keep me in her grip? It didn't matter. I had to go. I had no choice. The truth had already begun to unravel, and now there was no stopping it. There was no going back. I sent a quick reply, telling her I would be there in an hour. I stepped out of my room, glancing at my husband in the kitchen. He didn't look at me the way he used to. There was distance between us now, an invisible wall that neither of us seemed willing to tear down. I had no idea how to talk to him anymore. What could I even say? How could I explain what I knew? How could I make sense of the confusion swirling in my mind? As I got into my car, I couldn't stop the surge of anxiety that clutched at my chest. What awaited me at that house? And more importantly, what would I find when I faced Grandma? The old house loomed in front of me like a ghost from the past. Its broken windows and sagging porch were a stark contrast to the memories I once had of it. Once, it had been a place of warmth and family gatherings. Now, it felt cold, haunted by secrets that never should have been kept. I approached the door, my hand hovering over the knob. Was I ready for what I was about to face? My breath hitched in my throat as I pushed the door open, stepping into the musty, dimly lit hallway. "Grandma!" I called out softly, my voice trembling. No response. I took another step, the sound of my shoes echoing in the silence. And then I heard a noise, a creaking from upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I ascended the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. I was walking straight into the lion's den, and I had no idea what would happen when I got there. The hallway at the top of the stairs was shrouded in darkness, and as I made my way down it, I saw her, a shadow moving in the corner of the room. The door to her study was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from within. I stepped forward, my pulse racing. What did she want to say to me? What did she expect from me? I couldn't help but wonder if this was the end game, if this was when the truth finally came to light, or if I would be trapped in her lies forever. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. She was sitting at her desk, her back to me, the familiar scent of her perfume filling the air. She hadn't turned to face me, but I could feel her presence, the same sharp, calculating energy that I had grown up with. The woman who had controlled every aspect of my life. "You came," she said, her voice cold, but with an edge of amusement. "I knew you would. I couldn't speak at first." My mind was racing, the weight of the envelope still pressing heavily in my hands. What was I supposed to say to her now? How could I confront her when she had spent a lifetime twisting the truth? "I'm done with your games, Grandma," I said finally, my voice shaking with anger and fear. "I know what you've been doing. I know what you've done to this family. You've ruined everything." She turned slowly, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "You're naive if you think exposing me will change anything," she said, her lips curling into a smirk. "Everything is already in motion. You can't stop what's coming." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. What did she mean? What was coming? Before I could ask, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Another person was coming, someone from the shadows, someone who had been watching us this entire time. "Get ready for the truth," Grandma said with a chilling laugh. "It's about to get a lot worse." And then the door behind me slammed shut. What happens when the door slams shut? And the shadows around you seem to come alive. Who was behind me at that moment? Was it someone I knew? Or was it another puppet in Grandma's twisted game? My heart raced, each beat louder than the silence of the room. The air felt thick, as if it carried the weight of secrets too heavy to be spoken aloud. I turned slowly, the door looming behind me, but the figure standing in the hallway was not who I expected. Was it even someone I had ever expected to see again? The light from the study cast an eerie glow on the figure, revealing a face that sent chills down my spine. It was my father, his expression hard, unreadable. His presence was both a relief and a torment. Why was he here? Had Grandma called him, or had he come on his own? And more importantly, was he here to help me or to protect her? "Dad!" My voice was barely a whisper, laden with confusion and disbelief. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting between me and Grandma. The tension in the room thickened, and I couldn't help but wonder. Was he part of this conspiracy? Had he been in on it all along? "I told you not to dig too deep," he finally said, his voice low and firm. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." The room felt colder, darker. Why was he speaking like this? His words didn't sound like a warning. They sounded like a threat. What did he mean by dig too deep? Was he protecting her, or was he trying to protect himself? Grandma's laughter broke the silence, sharp and biting. "Oh, she's already in too deep, my dear. Don't you see? She's just like you, unable to resist the allure of the truth, no matter how dangerous it is." My father's face tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of guilt and anger, that made me question everything I thought I knew about him. Had he been a victim of her manipulations, too? Or had he willingly played his part in her games? What truth? I demanded, my voice trembling. What are you both hiding? Why does everything in this family have to be a secret? Neither of them answered immediately, but the silence spoke volumes. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the weight of their unspoken words pressing down on my chest. What were they afraid to tell me? And why did I feel like the answers would change everything? Grandma leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. "You've always been so curious, haven't you? Always asking questions, always trying to uncover the truth. But tell me, my dear, what will you do when you finally get your answers? Will it make you happy, or will it destroy you, like it's destroyed everyone else?" Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Was she trying to manipulate me, or was she genuinely warning me about what was to come? I couldn't tell any more. Every word she spoke felt like a double-edged sword, cutting deeper with each passing second. "I don't care what it does to me," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "I deserve to know the truth. This family deserves to know the truth." Grandma's smirk widened, and she glanced at my father. "Well, it seems she's made up her mind. What do you think, dear? Should we give her what she wants?" My father's jaw tightened, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and resignation. "She's not ready," he muttered, shaking his head. "She doesn't understand what she's asking for." But I did understand, or at least I thought I did. I was asking for freedom, for clarity, for a chance to break free from the lies that had bound this family for so long. Before I could say another word, Grandma opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a worn envelope. She held it up, her eyes glinting with a strange mixture of pride and malice. "This is what you've been looking for, isn't it?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The answers to all your questions, neatly laid out for you." I reached for the envelope, but she pulled it back, her smirk deepening. "Not so fast, my dear. If you're going to read this, you need to be prepared for what's inside. This letter is more than just words on paper. It's a doorway. Once you open it, there's no going back." Her words only fueled my determination. "Give it to me," I demanded, my voice firm. "I don't care What's inside? I need to know. She handed me the envelope with a flourish, as if she were giving me a gift rather than a curse. My hands trembled as I opened it, the aged paper crackling beneath my fingers. What secrets did it hold? What truths had been hidden for so long? The letter was written in a hand I didn't recognize, the words scrawled hastily across the page. My eyes scanned the first few lines, my heart pounding in my chest. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But before I left, I needed to tell you the truth. The truth about Margaret, about the family, about everything. My breath caught in my throat. Who had written this? What truth were they about to reveal? And why did I feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to plummet into darkness? Before I could read any further, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Someone else was coming. Someone who didn't want me to read the letter. The door creaked open, and I froze, clutching the letter tightly in my hands. Put that down, a voice commanded, cold and authoritative. I turned slowly, my heart racing, and found myself face to face with someone I never expected to see again, who stood behind the door. And why did their presence chill me to my core? Could it be someone sent to stop me from uncovering the truth? The air grew heavier with every second as the door creaked wider, revealing a figure I had hoped never to see again. Grandma's longtime confidant, Mrs. Evelyn. Why was she here now? And more importantly, what role had she played in this twisted web of secrets? Mrs. Evelyn stepped into the dimly lit room, her sharp eyes darting between the letter in my hand and Grandma's smug expression. "Margaret," she said in a low, reprimanding tone, "you promised me this would stay buried." Grandma's laughter, sharp and biting, echoed through the room. "Oh, Evelyn, don't be so dramatic. The girl deserves to know the truth, doesn't she? Or are you afraid of what she'll think of you once she finds out?" My grip tightened on the letter, my heart racing. "What is she talking about?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you have to do with this?" Mrs. Evelyn's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You think you're ready for the truth," she said, her voice cold. "But once you hear it, you'll wish you had stayed in the dark." What was she hiding? And why did her words sound more like a threat than a warning? Ignoring her, I turned my attention back to the letter, desperate for answers. My eyes scanned the words, each sentence pulling me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. Margaret wasn't always who she claimed to be. Before she was your grandmother, she was someone else. Someone who thrived on control, manipulation, and destruction. She didn't just ruin lives. She orchestrated their downfall with precision. The words blurred as my mind raced. Who had written this letter, and why were they exposing Grandma now? Was this their way of seeking justice? Or was it just another layer of her game? I looked up at Grandma, who watched me with an unnerving calm. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Were you someone else before?" Her smile widened, and she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "My dear, we're all someone else before we become who we are. The question is, do you have the courage to confront the person you used to be?" Mrs. Evelyn stepped closer, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. "Enough of this, Margaret," she snapped. "You don't need to drag her into your mess. Leave her out of it." Grandma's eyes flashed with amusement. "Oh, Evelyn, don't pretend you're innocent in all of this. You were there from the beginning, remember? You helped me build this life, brick by deceitful brick." The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and I realized with a sinking feeling that their relationship was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. How deep did their connection run? And what secrets had they kept together? Mrs. Evelyn's gaze softened as she turned to me. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "Whatever you think you know about her, it's worse. Much worse. But if you keep digging, you'll only end up hurting yourself." Her words made my stomach churn, but I couldn't stop now. "Why are you protecting her?" I demanded. "What are you so afraid of?" She hesitated, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, guilt, fear, whatever it was. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Before she could answer, the room plunged into darkness. The sudden loss of light sent my heart racing, and I fumbled for my phone to use its flashlight. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. No one responded. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of footsteps somewhere in the house. Who else was here? And why had the power gone out at such a crucial moment? A cold hand brushed against my shoulder, and I spun around, my flashlight illuminating Grandma's face. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite place, anticipation. "Don't be afraid," she said softly. "This is all part of the game." What game? And why did I feel like I was the pawn, not the player? The lights flickered back on, and my eyes darted around the room, searching for Mrs. Evelyn. She was gone. Where did she go? I asked, my voice sharp with panic. Grandma shrugged, her smile unwavering. She always runs when things get messy. It's her way of avoiding the consequences. I didn't believe her. Mrs. Evelyn hadn't struck me as the type to run from anything. Had she left on her own? Or had something or someone forced her to leave? I turned back to the letter, desperate for answers. The next line sent a chill down my spine. If you're reading this, it means you've started to see the cracks in her facade. But be warned. She won't let you uncover the truth without a fight. She'll twist everything around, make you doubt your own sanity, until you don't know what's real anymore. That's how she wins. The words felt like a warning and a challenge all at once. Could I trust what I was reading, or was this just another layer of her manipulation? A faint knock echoed through the room, startling me. My heart pounded as I turned toward the door, the letter clutched tightly in my hand. Who could it be now? Another ally? Another enemy? Or was it someone who could finally bring me the answers I so desperately sought? "Come in," Grandma called, her tone almost playful. The door creaked open, and I held my breath as a familiar figure stepped inside. My blood ran cold. It was someone I never thought I'd see again. Someone whose presence raised more questions than it answered. Who were they? And why did I suddenly feel like the truth was slipping further and further out of my reach? How many layers of deception were still left to uncover? As the door creaked open, revealing the unexpected figure, my breath caught in my throat. Why were they here? And more importantly, whose side were they on? The figure stepped into the room, their face illuminated by the dim light. It was Liam, my husband's closest friend, a man who had always seemed loyal and trustworthy. But seeing him now, standing in the same space as my manipulative grandmother, felt like betrayal in its purest form. "Liam," I asked, my voice trembling with confusion, "what are you doing here?" His expression was guarded, his eyes darting between me and Grandma. "I came to warn you," he said finally, his tone low and urgent. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "Warn me about what?" Every word he spoke seemed to tangle the web of questions further. Why was he involved in this nightmare? And what secrets was he keeping? Grandma chuckled softly, her amusement almost sinister. "Oh, Liam," she purred, "you're always so dramatic. Tell me, dear, are you here out of loyalty to her or to me?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. What did she mean by that? Could Liam be part of her schemes, or was he truly here to help me? "Don't listen to her," Liam said, his voice sharp. "She's trying to confuse you. She'll twist everything to her advantage, just like she always does." I wanted to believe him, but the doubt lingered. What if he was just another piece of her puzzle, placed here to manipulate me further? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. Before I could respond, Liam turned to Grandma, his expression hardening. "This ends now, Margaret," he said, his voice filled with determination. "You've hurt enough people. It's time to stop." Her smile faltered for the first time. a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. "You think you can save her from the truth. The truth. That elusive, devastating truth that seemed just out of reach. What were they hiding from me? And why did it feel like every step closer brought me closer to ruin?" Liam's gaze shifted to me, his eyes filled with something that looked like guilt. "There's something you need to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about your father." My heart sank. My father? What did he have to do with this? And why was Liam the one to tell me? Before he could say more, my attention was drawn back to the letter in my hand. There were still pages left unread, their secrets waiting to be revealed. With trembling fingers, I turned to the next page, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears. Margaret has always been a master of manipulation, but her greatest weapon is the truth she keeps hidden. She knows the power of secrets and the destruction they can cause when revealed. But what she fears most is losing control of the narrative. The narrative. That was what this was all about, wasn't it? Control. Power. The ability to shape the truth into whatever served her best. But whose secrets was she protecting? And what would happen when they came to light? "I need you to listen to me," Liam said urgently, pulling me back to the present. "Your father, he wasn't who you thought he was." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What does this have to do with Grandma?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he was fighting an internal battle. "Your father and Margaret," he began, then stopped, his eyes darting to Grandma. She'll never admit it, but their relationship wasn't just familial. The room seemed to spin around me as his words sank in. What was he saying? That my grandmother and my father had been involved? The very thought made my stomach churn. Grandma's expression darkened, her calm exterior cracking for the first time. "That's enough, Liam," she snapped, her voice like ice. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the fear in her eyes told a different story. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, a vulnerability she couldn't hide. Was this the truth she had been so desperate to keep hidden? And if so, what did it mean for me? "I know everything," Liam said, his voice steady. "And so does Evelyn. You think you can keep this buried, but it's all going to come out." Evelyn! The name sent a jolt through me. She had disappeared after the last confrontation, leaving more questions than answers. Was she the key to unraveling this mess? Before I could process what was happening, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, the beam of its flashlight cutting through the shadows. "Stay where you are," Liam said, his voice firm. "We're not alone." The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere nearby, followed by a faint, chilling laugh. My grip on the flashlight tightened as fear coursed through me. Who was here? And what did they want? "Grandma," I whispered, my voice trembling. Her laughter, soft and eerie, came from the darkness. "Oh, my dear," she said, her tone dripping with malice. "The game has only just begun." What game was she playing now? And how much more could I endure before the truth finally broke me? How do you rebuild trust when every layer of your life feels like a lie? The question swirled endlessly in my mind as the chilling laughter faded into the silence. What did Grandma mean by the game? And why did it feel like I was the pawn in her sinister strategy? The moment of tense silence was broken by the creak of the front door opening. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned toward the sound. Who else could possibly be here? Has Evelyn returned? Or was it someone else drawn into the vortex of chaos Grandma had created? The footsteps were deliberate, each one echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. When the figure finally stepped into the beam of my light, I froze. It wasn't Evelyn. It was Carter, my neighbor's father, and the man whose name had surfaced in Grandma's tangled web of deceit. "Carter!" I stammered, my voice barely audible. What are you doing here?" His face was a mask of guilt and fear, his hands trembling as he held up a piece of paper. "I received this," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a letter from Margaret." What new chaos had she unleashed now? And why was Carter, of all people, holding a piece of the puzzle? I took the letter from him, my hands trembling as I unfolded it. The words, written in Grandma's distinct, elegant handwriting, sent chills down my spine. "Carter, you thought your secrets were safe, but nothing stays buried forever. Come to the house tonight if you value what little remains of your reputation." Why was she dragging him into this? What could she possibly have on him that would force him to come here in the middle of the night? And why did it feel like this was all leading to something far darker than I could comprehend? "Why would she send this to you?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. "What is she holding over you?" Carter looked away, his jaw tightening as if the weight of his secrets was too much to bear. "It's complicated," he said finally. "But you need to know, Margaret isn't just manipulating people. She's orchestrating something much bigger." Liam stepped forward, his expression hard as he stared at Carter. "Bigger how?" he asked sharply. "What does she have on you?" Carter hesitated, glancing nervously at me before finally speaking. "She knows about the affair," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She knows about everything." My breath caught in my throat. The affair. Was he referring to his rumored relationship with Grandma? Or was there more to this story than I had imagined? The sheer magnitude of her manipulation was staggering. How many lives had she entangled in her web of lies? "And she's using it against you," Liam said, his tone laced with disgust. Typical Margaret. But why? Why was Grandma so intent on controlling everyone around her? And what was she hoping to achieve with this game of secrets and threats? As we stood there, piecing together fragments of the truth, Grandma's voice echoed from the shadows. "Ah, Carter," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "Always so predictable. Did you really think I wouldn't have contingencies in place?" She stepped into the light, her calm demeanor at odds with the chaos she had unleashed. "You see," she continued, "the truth is a powerful thing. But what makes it even more powerful is knowing when to use it." "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. "What's the point of all this manipulation?" Grandma smiled, her expression almost pitying. "Oh, my dear," she said softly, "the point isn't the manipulation itself. It's the power it gives me over everyone who dares to cross me." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Was this all just a game to her? A way to maintain control in a world where trust had become a currency she could exploit? Liam turned to me, his expression grim. "We can't let her win," he said firmly. "She's counting on us to fall apart, to turn on each other. But if we work together, we can expose her for what she really is." I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Could I trust him? Could I trust Carter? Or was this just another layer of Grandma's plan, designed to make me doubt everything and everyone? Before I could answer, a new voice broke the silence. "You won't have to do it alone." I turned to see Evelyn standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She held a folder in her hands, the contents spilling out like pieces of a shattered puzzle. "I found this," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's everything. Proof of what she's done, of who she really is." As she handed me the folder, I felt a mix of relief and dread. The truth was finally within reach, but at what cost? And what would it reveal about the people I thought I knew? The sound of glass shattering upstairs sent a jolt of fear through me, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Someone was in the house. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out. "We need to move," Liam said urgently, grabbing my arm. "Now." But as we turned to leave, Grandma's laughter echoed through the house, cold and unyielding. "You think you've won," she called out. "You think the truth will set you free. Oh, my dear, the truth is the most dangerous weapon of all." What did she mean by that? And who was waiting for us upstairs? As the tension reached its breaking point, One thing was clear. This game was far from over. How much betrayal can one heart withstand? What happens when the very foundation of trust shatters completely, leaving only echoes of deceit? Ethan sat in his car outside his family home, his mind reeling from the storm of revelations. Could there be more to uncover, or had he reached the breaking point of this tangled web of treachery? Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as the chilling memory of his grandmother's cryptic words replayed in his head. The truth you seek might destroy you, Ethan. Are you sure you want to keep digging? That warning, more sinister than protective, echoed in his mind. But was it too late to stop? Could he even turn back now? The events of the past few weeks had unraveled his life. His grandmother's hidden affairs, his father's involvement, and the revelation about his wife's betrayal were enough to drive anyone to the edge. Yet, something felt incomplete. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was one final piece to the puzzle. A dark truth that would either provide closure or consume him entirely. He finally mustered the courage to step out of his car and walk into the house. As he pushed open the front door, an eerie silence greeted him. The once vibrant and bustling home now felt like a hollow shell, weighed down by the secrets it harbored. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified, as though the house itself was mourning the loss of innocence. His eyes fell upon a stack of old photographs on the coffee table. They hadn't been there before. With trembling hands, Ethan sifted through the images. Some were of happier times. Birthday parties, family dinners, and holiday celebrations. But one photo made his breath hitch. A black and white picture of his grandmother, younger and radiant, standing beside a man Ethan didn't recognize. Who was he? And why did the sight of him send a shiver down Ethan's spine? Tucked behind the photograph was a handwritten note in his grandmother's unmistakable cursive. To my one true love, who made me feel alive. I'll always remember our secret garden. The cryptic message was dated nearly 3 decades ago. Ethan's heart raced. A secret garden? What did that mean? And more importantly, who was the man in the photo? Desperation clawed at him as he searched the house for answers. He rummaged through drawers, overturned cushions, and tore through boxes in the attic. Finally, in an old jewelry box hidden in the back of a closet, he found a key. It was small and ornate, engraved with a single word, Serenity. Ethan couldn't remember a place called Serenity in their family history, but the name felt strangely familiar. As he stared at the key, his grandmother's perfume lingered in the air, a sickly sweet scent that made his stomach churn. The sensation was unsettling, as though she was watching him from the shadows, even in her absence. Downstairs, the sound of footsteps made him freeze. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he crept toward the living room, his pulse thundering in his ears. To his relief, it was only his cousin Claire, who had let herself in with a spare key. "Ethan," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "We need to talk. There's something you need to know about Grandma." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "What now, Claire? What more could there possibly be?" He slammed the photograph down on the table, his finger pointing to the mystery man. "Who is this? What does Serenity mean?" Claire's face paled, her eyes darting to the photograph as though it held a ghost she had long tried to forget. "Where did you find that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "That man, he's not just anyone. He's our mother's real father." The weight of her words crashed over Ethan like a tidal wave. Another secret? Another betrayal? His mind spiraled as he tried to comprehend what this revelation meant. If his grandmother had lied about their family's lineage, then what else had she kept hidden? Claire hesitated before speaking again, her eyes filled with fear. "Ethan, there's something else. That key you're holding, it's to a place Grandma used to go when she disappeared for weeks at a time. I thought it was just a garden, but it's not. It's where everything started." Ethan stared at the key in his hand, the word Serenity burning into his palm like a brand. "Where is this place, Claire?" he demanded. Her response was barely audible. "It's on the outskirts of town, near the old willow grove." "But, Ethan, Don't go there alone." Her warning hung heavy in the air, but Ethan's resolve hardened. He knew he had to go. Whatever secrets lay buried in that place called Serenity, he was determined to unearth them, no matter the cost. But as he drove toward the Willow Grove later that night, a single question haunted him. Was he uncovering the truth to find closure, or was he walking straight into the heart of a nightmare he might never escape? What would you do if you stood at the threshold of secrets so dark they could rewrite everything you believed? Would you take the step, or would you turn away? Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter as he approached the Willow Grove. Why had his grandmother kept this place hidden? And what horrifying truths waited for him there? The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the desolate road. Ethan's mind raced with the fragments of revelations Claire had shared. His grandmother's mysterious lover, the truth about his mother's lineage, and now this cryptic place called Serenity. He felt as though he was chasing shadows, each one darker and more foreboding than the last. As he pulled into the clearing, the towering willows swayed gently, their elongated branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The grove was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. In the center stood an old wrought iron gate, its intricate design marred by decades of rust. A plaque hung loosely on the gate, the word Serenity barely legible under layers of grime. Ethan's heart pounded as he inserted the ornate key he'd found earlier. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. He hesitated, his breath hitching. Was he truly ready to face what lay beyond? The gate creaked open, revealing a garden that had once been beautiful, but was now overgrown and wild. Weeds had strangled the life out of the flowers, and the stone pathways were cracked and moss-covered. In the center of the garden stood a small stone structure, its door ajar. As Ethan approached, he noticed the faint scent of his grandmother's perfume lingering in the air, as if she had been there recently. His mind swirled with questions. Had she brought her lovers here? Had she buried her secrets within these walls? He pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with items that seemed frozen in time. There were old photographs, handwritten letters, and a jewelry box that gleamed in the dim light. One photograph caught his attention, a picture of his grandmother sitting on a bench with the same man from the black and white photo. This time, she looked younger and happier, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. The air inside the structure was heavy, almost suffocating. The dim lighting cast shadows that seemed to shift and dance as Ethan moved. He picked up one of the letters, the paper brittle with age. The words, written in his grandmother's elegant script, were haunting. "My dearest, I wish we could escape this web of lies. If only I could start anew, free from the chains of expectation. You are my only solace in this chaotic world." The more Ethan read, the more he realized how deeply his grandmother had been entangled in deception. Her double life wasn't just a fleeting indiscretion. It was a meticulously woven tapestry of secrets that spanned decades. Ethan's head spun as he tried to make sense of it all. Could these letters provide the answers he so desperately sought? Or were they merely breadcrumbs leading him further into the abyss? His grandmother had always been a master of manipulation. Was this another one of her games, designed to keep him chasing shadows? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around, his pulse racing. Standing in the doorway was Claire, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I told you not to come here alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you doing here?" Ethan demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting around the room. "I couldn't let you face this alone," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Ethan's unease grew. Was she here to help, or was there something she wasn't telling him? Claire's gaze settled on the jewelry box. She reached for it, her hands shaking. "Ethan," she said, her voice cracking, "there's something you need to see." She opened the box, revealing a small, intricately carved locket. Inside was a photograph of the man from the letters and a lock of hair. Ethan stared at it, his stomach twisting. What kind of woman keeps such intimate tokens from a lover? decades after their affair. But it wasn't the locket that truly unnerved him. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Claire picked it up and unfolded it slowly. Her eyes widened as she read the words, her face contorting with fear. "What does it say?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising. Claire handed him the paper with trembling hands. The words scrawled across it sent a chill down his spine. "Serenity is where it all began. It's where it will all end." The cryptic message hung in the air like a storm cloud. What did it mean? Was it a warning or a promise? And what was the significance of this place called Serenity? Ethan's mind raced as he realized he had only scratched the surface of the secrets buried here. As the night deepened and the shadows grew darker, Ethan and Claire stood at the crossroads of revelation and ruin. But the question remained, would uncovering the truth set them free, or would it destroy them both? What do you do when the truth you seek begins to stare back at you, unraveling the life you thought you knew? As Ethan unfolded the brittle paper in his hands, the words etched upon it felt like a dagger carving through his soul. Was this finally the key to his grandmother's labyrinth of lies, or just another dead end in the maze? Ethan stood frozen, the cryptic words from the note echoing in his mind. Serenity is where it all began. It's where it will all end. Beside him, Claire's breath was shallow, her hands clenched into fists as though bracing for an unseen storm. The oppressive silence of the grove pressed down on them, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. "What does it mean?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "What ends here, Ethan?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared at the locket and the note, his mind racing through the fragments of his grandmother's life that he had pieced together. The lovers, the betrayals, the lies. It all pointed to Serenity. But was this place merely a sanctuary for her secrets? Or was it a tomb that held something far darker? Determined to find answers, Ethan began searching the small stone structure more thoroughly. The dim light of his flashlight danced across the walls, revealing faded photographs and old documents tucked into crevices. Each discovery felt like peeling back another layer of his grandmother's carefully constructed facade. One photograph caught his attention. It was a black and white image of his grandmother, standing with the same mysterious man, her expression one of quiet triumph. In the background, a sprawling mansion loomed, its windows dark and foreboding. Scribbled on the back of the photograph was a single word, Havenwood. "Do you recognize this place?" Ethan asked, holding the photograph out to Claire. Her eyes widened as she stared at the image. "I've heard of it," she said slowly. "It's an old estate just outside of town. But why would she keep this?" Ethan didn't reply. His gut told him that Havenwood was the next piece of the puzzle, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was also a trap. His grandmother had always been meticulous, every move calculated. What if she had left this trail of breadcrumbs deliberately, leading him into her web? As they left the grove and made their way back to Ethan's car, the tension between them was palpable. The once serene grove now felt sinister, the shadows of the willow trees stretching across the ground like grasping hands. Even the night air seemed colder, as though the very earth was warning them to turn back. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly as they drove toward Havenwood. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in on them with every passing mile. Claire sat silently beside him, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. "That this isn't just about your grandmother anymore," Claire replied. "It's about all of us. She's tied us all to her secrets, her sins. And now we're the ones paying the price." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. She was right. This wasn't just his grandmother's story. It was a legacy of betrayal and deceit that had ensnared their entire family. And as much as he hated to admit it, he wasn't sure they would survive uncovering the truth. When they finally reached Havenwood, the sight of the estate took Ethan's breath away. The mansion was massive, its once grand facade now crumbling with age. Ivy crept up the stone walls, and the windows were dark and lifeless. Yet there was an undeniable air of grandeur, as though the estate was still clinging to its former glory. "This place gives me the creeps," Claire muttered, shivering. "Are you sure we're doing the right thing?" "We don't have a choice," Ethan replied. "If this is where it all began, then it's where we'll find the answers." But as they approached the front door, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadows. Was it just his imagination, or had something moved in the distance? The door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer shrouded in darkness. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards groaned beneath their feet. They ventured deeper into the mansion, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Ethan's flashlight illuminated faded portraits on the walls, each one depicting a stern-faced ancestor. At the end of the hallway, they found a door slightly ajar. Inside was a study, its walls lined with bookshelves. In the center of the room stood a desk, its surface cluttered with papers and an old typewriter. But it was what lay on the desk that made Ethan's blood run cold. A letter addressed to him, written in his grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. "What is this?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan picked up the letter, his hands shaking. As he read the first line, his heart sank. "To my dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, then you followed my trail. I always knew you would, but there's something you need to know, something that will change everything." Before he could read further, a loud crash echoed through the mansion, followed by the sound of footsteps. Ethan and Claire froze, their eyes wide with fear. Who, or what, was in the house with them? As the shadows in Havenwood seemed to come alive, Ethan and Claire realized they were no longer just uncovering secrets. They were fighting to escape them. But could they survive long enough to learn the truth, or had they already walked into their doom? What would you do if the answers you've been chasing finally stared back at you? But they were darker than anything you imagined. As Ethan and Claire crept through Havenwood's decaying halls, the echoes of their own footsteps seemed to whisper the warnings they couldn't afford to ignore. But would they listen before it was too late? The study's heavy atmosphere clung to them, the air thick with dust and foreboding. Ethan's trembling hands gripped the letter tighter, his eyes darting over the words as Claire stood by, her breath shallow and anxious. The letter felt like a trap, each word luring him further into the darkness of his grandmother's schemes. "You've always been curious, Ethan. You've always asked too many questions. But here's one you need to ask yourself. Can you handle the truth you're about to uncover?" Ethan's eyes burned as they scanned the lines. His grandmother's words were a calculated dance between revelation and misdirection. Was this her final game, or a desperate attempt to protect him from something even she couldn't control? "What does it say?" Claire's voice broke the silence, her tone a mix of urgency and fear. "She's daring me to find the truth," Ethan whispered, the weight of the letter sinking into him. "But it's more than that. She's warning me. This place, it's more than just a house. It's the key to everything." Before they could make sense of the letter, another crash reverberated through the mansion, louder this time. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "We're not alone," she hissed. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. He stuffed the letter into his pocket and gestured toward the hallway. "We need to keep moving." They stepped out of the study, the darkness around them feeling thicker, almost alive. The flashlight beam wavered as Ethan's hand shook, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. Each step felt heavier than the last, the mansion silence broken only by their cautious movements and the occasional distant creak, as if the house itself was breathing. "What do you think she meant by where it began?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Ethan replied. "But whatever it is, it's here, and it's waiting for us." The further they ventured, the more the mansion seemed to twist and shift around them. The grand halls felt narrower, the once luxurious decor now grotesque in its decay. A faint smell of roses lingered in the air, sickly sweet and overpowering, a haunting echo of his grandmother's favorite perfume. Ethan's mind raced with fragments of memories. He recalled the faint whispers he'd overheard as a child, the half-finished conversations that stopped the moment he entered the room. His grandmother's voice, calm yet chilling, echoed in his mind. Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered, Ethan. But why? Why had she gone to such lengths to bury the truth? And why had she chosen him to unearth it now? Ethan, look. Claire's urgent whisper snapped him back to reality. She was pointing at a faded painting hanging crookedly on the wall. It depicted a family gathered in front of Havenwood, their expressions eerily neutral. At the center stood Ethan's grandmother, her hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a man Ethan didn't recognize. "Who is he?" Claire asked, her eyes narrowing. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but he looks familiar." The man's face was strikingly similar to Ethan's own, the resemblance sending a chill down his spine. Was this another clue, or another cruel joke? They continued down the hall, their footsteps growing quieter as the tension between them mounted. The letter had hinted at a hidden room, a place where his grandmother's secrets had been locked away. But the mansion was a labyrinth, each turn leading them deeper into its shadowy embrace. "Do you hear that?" Claire froze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. Above them, faint footsteps echoed, deliberate and slow. "Someone's up there," Ethan said, his voice low. "Or something," Claire muttered, summoning their courage. They found a staircase and ascended carefully. The creaking steps seemed to scream under their weight, announcing their presence to whatever, or whoever, awaited them above. The second floor was darker, the air colder. Dust particles floated like tiny specters in the flashlight beam. At the end of the hall, they found a door slightly ajar. Ethan's heart pounded as he pushed it open, revealing a small room cluttered with papers, photographs, and trinkets. In the center of the room was a single chair, facing an old phonograph that sat silent and waiting. Claire approached the chair cautiously. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer. His attention was drawn to a photograph pinned to the wall. It was of his grandmother and the mysterious man again, but this time they were holding hands, their smiles unsettlingly genuine. Beneath the photo was a scrawled note, "Together in truth, forever in lies." Ethan turned to the phonograph, his hands trembling as he lifted the needle and placed it on the record. The room filled with static before a voice emerged, a voice Ethan recognized all too well. It was his grandmother. "Ethan," the recording began, "if you've made it this far, then you're braver than I ever imagined. But bravery alone won't save you. The truth you seek is buried in Havenwood's heart, and once you find it, there's no turning back. Be careful, my dear boy. The answers may destroy you." The recording ended abruptly, leaving them in deafening silence. But before they could react, the door behind them slammed shut, and the sound of footsteps grew louder, closing in on the room. "Ethan, we have to get out of here," Claire cried, her voice tinged with panic. But Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the photograph. He had come too far to turn back now. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, even if it meant confronting the shadows of his own bloodline. As the walls of Havenwood seemed to close in around them, Ethan and Claire realized they weren't just chasing secrets. They were being hunted by them. Would they uncover the truth before it consumed them, or had they already crossed the point of no return? If you were standing on the edge of a revelation so devastating it could shatter your sense of reality, would you step forward or turn back? Ethan and Claire's relentless pursuit of the truth had brought them to Havenwood's darkest corners. But were they ready to face the final piece of the puzzle? Or had the shadows already sealed their fate? The narrow hallway stretched out before them, its walls warped and cracked like the veins of an ancient, dying beast. Ethan and Claire moved cautiously, their breaths shallow as they tried to make sense of the cryptic recording they had just heard. The air was damp and heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent that set their nerves on edge. The heart of Havenwood, Ethan repeated under his breath, his voice barely audible over the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. What did she mean by that? Is it a place? A room? Or a person? Claire whispered, her eyes darting toward Ethan. The thought hung in the air, unspoken but understood. If the heart of Havenwood wasn't a location, then who, or what, could it be? As they reached the end of the hallway, they found themselves standing before a massive, intricately carved door. The wood was dark and polished, adorned with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light. Ethan reached out to touch the handle, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. "Wait," Claire said, grabbing his arm. "What if it's a trap? What if this is exactly what you wanted? What choice do we have?" Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room that seemed to exist outside of time. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their contents spilling onto the floor in chaotic piles. A chandelier hung overhead, its once glorious crystals now dull and lifeless. At the center of the room stood a large, circular table, its surface covered in papers, photographs, and objects that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. "This must be it," Ethan said, stepping forward. "The heart of Havenwood." Claire followed cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air thick with an unnatural tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper seemed amplified, as if the room itself was alive and watching them. Ethan's gaze fell on a photograph lying at the edge of the table. He picked it up, his heart pounding as he recognized the faces staring back at him. It was a family portrait, but not the kind he remembered. His grandmother stood at the center, flanked by two men Ethan didn't recognize. One of them was the man from the previous photographs, his resemblance to Ethan even more striking now. The other was older, his face lined with age and weariness. "Who are they?" Claire asked, peering over his shoulder. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But they're connected to her, to all of this." As Ethan stared at the photograph, fragments of memories began to surface, disjointed flashes of moments he couldn't place. He saw his grandmother sitting at this very table, her hands trembling as she wrote something in a leather-bound journal. He saw the two men arguing, their voices muffled, but their anger palpable. And he saw himself, a child hiding in the shadows, watching it all unfold. "What are you hiding from me?" Ethan muttered, his grip on the photograph tightening. "Why did you bring me here?" "Ethan, look at this," Claire said, pulling his attention to a stack of papers on the table. She held up a handwritten letter, the ink faded but still legible. The words were hauntingly familiar. "The truth is a burden, one I never wanted to bear, but it's also a legacy, one that cannot be denied. To understand the heart of Havenwood, you must first understand yourself." "It's her handwriting," Ethan said, his voice tinged with both awe and dread. "She left this for us to find." "But why?" Claire asked. "What does she want us to understand?" As they sifted through the papers, a clearer picture began to emerge. A picture that was both horrifying and impossible to ignore. The documents detailed a web of deceit and betrayal that spanned generations, implicating not only Ethan's grandmother, but also the mysterious men in the photographs. There were letters, contracts, and journal entries, each one revealing a new layer of the family's dark history. "It's all connected," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "The affairs, the lies, the manipulation, it's all been leading to this." "But why involve you?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed. "What makes you so important?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was beginning to take shape in his mind, but it was a truth he wasn't ready to face. Before they could process what they had uncovered, a sudden noise shattered the silence, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The chandelier above them began to sway, its crystals clinking like sinister wind chimes. "Ethan, we need to get out of here," Claire said, her voice trembling. But Ethan didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the table, where a single object now lay in plain sight, a small, ornate key. "She wants us to find this," he said, reaching for the key, as his fingers closed around it. The room plunged into darkness. The growling grew louder, surrounding them as the walls seemed to close in. "Ethan!" Claire screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony of sound, leaving them both trapped in the heart of Havenwood, with no way out. The mansion had revealed its secrets, but at what cost? As Ethan and Claire struggled to escape the shadows closing in around them, one question remained. Was the key their salvation or their doom? What do you do when every answer leads to another question? When the truth feels like a blade, cutting deeper with each revelation? For Ethan and Claire, the shadows of Havenwood held promises of both salvation and destruction. But which would come first? The air outside Havenwood Manor was frigid, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. Ethan stood by the cracked fountain in the courtyard, staring at the small, ornate key in his hand. It glimmered faintly under the pale moonlight, as though it was alive, an artifact with its own secrets. Claire stood beside him, shivering, though not from the cold. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan didn't reply immediately. His thoughts were a storm, each one clashing with the next. The key was supposed to be the final piece of the puzzle, but why did it feel like the beginning of something far worse? His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, a haunting memory from one of her cryptic recordings. To unlock the truth, you must first open the door you fear most. "Do we have another choice?" Ethan finally said, glancing at Claire. His expression was a mixture of determination and fear. "We've come too far to stop now." Claire hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the manor's looming facade. It stood like a monolith against the night sky, its windows dark and unyielding. What if we're wrong? What if this doesn't lead to answers, but to something worse? "Then we'll face it," Ethan said, gripping the key tighter. Together, the sound of their footsteps on the cobblestone path echoed in the stillness, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence that surrounded them. The manor seemed to watch them as they approached, its shadow stretching out like an invitation or a warning. As they reached the side entrance, Ethan hesitated. The key in his hand felt heavier now, as though it was resisting him. He glanced at Claire, who nodded silently, her jaw set in grim determination. With a deep breath, Ethan inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud, and the door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. "Of course it's a basement," Claire muttered, her sarcasm a thin veil over her growing fear. Ethan managed a weak smile. "What did you expect? A ballroom." The descent into the basement was slow and tense, each step accompanied by the groan of aged wood. The air grew colder with every passing moment, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang. Ethan's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls lined with shelves overflowing with dusty books, jars of unidentifiable substances, and peculiar trinkets. "This isn't just a basement," Claire said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's a vault of secrets." Ethan nodded, his gaze falling on a large, weathered chest in the center of the room. It was bound with iron and adorned with carvings that seemed to writhe in the flashlight's glow. The chest was secured with a lock that bore the same ornate design as the key in Ethan's hand. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what you wanted us to find." As Ethan approached the chest, his mind was bombarded with flashes of fragmented memories, his grandmother whispering to someone in the dark, the sound of a baby crying, the taste of something bitter on his tongue. The memories felt foreign yet familiar, as though they belonged to someone else, but were stitched into his own mind. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ethan blinked, shaking his head. "Yeah, just memories. Or something like memories. Are you sure they're yours?" Claire's question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he knelt before the chest and inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism groaned in protest, but after a moment, it clicked open. The lid of the chest creaked as Ethan lifted it, revealing its contents. Inside were bundles of old letters tied with ribbon, a stack of faded photographs, and a small, intricately carved box. The atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, the air growing heavier as though the chest's opening had disturbed something ancient and restless. Ethan picked up one of the letters, his hands trembling as he unfolded the yellowed paper. The handwriting was his grandmother's. Sharp and deliberate. To the one who dares to open this, know that the truth will destroy you before it sets you free. What lies within this chest is not just a story. It is a legacy, a curse that binds us all. What does it mean? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, his eyes scanning the letter for answers that weren't there. I don't know, but it's not just about her. It's about all of us. Before they could delve further, a sudden noise shattered the stillness, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. Did you hear that? Claire whispered, her grip on Ethan's arm tightening. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. We're not alone. As the growling grew louder, the door at the top of the staircase slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Ethan fumbled with the flashlight, but it refused to turn back on. Ethan, Claire said, her voice trembling. What do we do now? The answer came not from Ethan, but from the darkness itself. A whisper, soft and chilling. You shouldn't have come here. What had they unleashed? As the shadows closed in and the whispers grew louder, Ethan and Claire were left with one terrifying question. Were they uncovering the truth, or had the truth already found them? What happens when the answers you seek begin to question you instead? Could Ethan and Claire still trust what they knew, or had they already lost themselves to the web of deceit? And what was the source of that haunting voice echoing in the darkness? The room was suffocating. Ethan could barely breathe as the whispers grew louder, weaving through the darkness like threads of malice. His flashlight refused to cooperate, its bulb flickering uselessly. Claire clung to his arm, her nails digging into his skin, her voice a hushed tremor. "Who's there?" she demanded, her words braver than her tone. The only response was silence, thick and oppressive, before the whisper returned. Closer this time, deliberate. "You shouldn't have come here." Ethan's mind raced. Was this another trap? Another ploy crafted by his grandmother, even beyond the grave? Or was there something far older, far more sinister, lurking in the shadows of Havenwood Manor's secrets? "Stay close," Ethan whispered, gripping Claire's hand tightly. He stepped toward the chest, its contents now feeling less like answers and more like a warning. The carved box within seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, as though it was alive. "What's in the box?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I think it's what we're supposed to find. And what if we're not supposed to open it?" Claire countered, her fear turning to anger. What if this is exactly what she wanted? To pull us into something we can't escape? Ethan didn't reply. His fingers brushed against the box, and the room seemed to react. The air grew colder, the whispers intensifying into an unintelligible chorus. Claire yanked him back. "Don't," she warned. "Not yet." Instead, they turned to the letters, each one a fragment of the past waiting to be pieced together. Ethan unfolded another, the paper brittle beneath his fingers. This one was dated decades earlier, written in the same sharp handwriting. If you are reading this, then you are ready to face the truth. But beware, the truth is not what you think. It is not a revelation, but a weapon. It will cut through everything you know, everything you are, and leave you with nothing but questions. Do you think she knew we'd find this? Claire asked, peering over his shoulder. She didn't just know, Ethan replied. She planned it. He flipped the letter over, revealing a sketch on the back. an intricate diagram of the manor, with a small, unmarked room circled in red. It was a room Ethan had never seen before. "Where is this?" Claire asked. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice thick with dread. "But we have to find it." Their search for the hidden room led them deeper into the manor, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The creak of floorboards beneath their feet was the only sound, save for their breathing and the occasional whisper that sent chills down their spines. "This place feels wrong," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like it's alive." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the walls for any sign of the room from the diagram. The air seemed heavier here, pressing down on them as though the manor itself disapproved of their presence. Finally, they found it, a narrow door hidden behind a tapestry at the end of a dimly lit hallway. The door was unmarked, its surface worn smooth, as if it had been opened and closed countless times over the years. "This is it," Ethan said, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "What if we're not ready?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "Then we'll never be," Ethan replied, turning the knob. The room beyond was small and unremarkable, its walls lined with shelves filled with books and trinkets. A single table stood in the center, and on it lay a journal bound in cracked leather. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. Ethan picked up the journal, his hands trembling as he opened it to the first page. The handwriting was familiar, his grandmother's, but the words were anything but comforting. "To those who follow know this. You are part of something far greater than yourself. You are bound by blood, by secrets, and by lies. And if you are reading this, then you are already too late." The words sent a chill through Ethan, but it was the photograph tucked between the pages that truly stopped his heart. It was a picture of his grandmother, but not as he remembered her. She was younger, smiling, and standing beside a man Ethan had never seen before, holding a baby in her arms. "Who is that?" Claire asked, leaning over his shoulder. "I don't know," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. "But I think it's my father." Before they could process the revelation, the door behind them slammed shut. The sound echoed through the small room, followed by the unmistakable click of a lock. "What's happening?" Claire asked, panic rising in her voice. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the journal, where new words seemed to be appearing on the page, written in the same sharp handwriting. "You have opened the door. Now face what lies beyond." The room plunged into darkness, the whispers returning with a vengeance. This time, they were louder, clearer, and terrifyingly familiar. They were calling Ethan's name. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Ethan swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "We face it." But as the darkness closed in, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited them wasn't meant to be faced. It was meant to destroy. What had they truly uncovered? As the shadows grew thicker and the whispers more insistent, one question loomed above all others. Was this the truth they had been seeking, or the end of everything they knew? What happens when you confront the darkness, only to find it staring back at you? How far would you go to uncover the truth, knowing it could destroy everything you've ever believed? Could Ethan and Claire survive what was waiting for them? The suffocating darkness pressed against them, alive with whispers that crawled into Ethan's mind, pulling at the edges of his sanity. Claire's grip on his arm tightened, her trembling breaths the only other sound in the room. But then the whispers ceased, replaced by a single voice, calm, measured, and eerily familiar. "Why did you come here, Ethan?" the voice asked. It was his grandmother's voice, yet it came from everywhere and nowhere. Ethan's pulse quickened. "You knew we'd come," he said, his voice trembling. "You wanted this?" "Perhaps," the voice replied. "But do you want what you will find?" The room's oppressive silence returned, and Ethan fumbled with the journal in his hands. The pages had shifted again, words appearing in real time, as though written by an invisible hand. Claire shone the flashlight over his shoulder, and they read together. To those who seek the truth, this is your last chance to turn back. Beyond this lies the final answer, but it is not salvation. It is a curse that binds us all. What does that mean? Claire whispered. Ethan flipped the page, his hands shaking. The next words chilled him to the core. The bloodline must end. Claire gasped. What is she talking about? I don't know, Ethan admitted, though he felt the weight of his grandmother's words like a noose tightening around his neck. But I think we're about to find out. Their attention was drawn to the table in the center of the room. Beneath the journal lay another object, something they hadn't noticed before. It was a small, ornate box, similar to the one they'd seen earlier. But this one was wrapped in a chain, its lock secured with an intricate seal. Ethan hesitated. Do you think this is what she wanted us to find? Claire shook her head. I think it's what she didn't want us to open. But Ethan's curiosity outweighed his fear. He reached for the box, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the chain. The whispers returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices warning him to stop. Yet he couldn't. The pull was irresistible. As the chain fell away, the seal cracked open with an audible hiss. Inside was a single photograph, yellowed with age. It showed a young woman holding a baby, her face blurred as though erased from memory. But it wasn't the woman that caught Ethan's attention. It was the man beside her. That's my father, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire frowned. Are you sure? Yes, Ethan insisted. I'd know that face anywhere. But who's the woman? As Ethan stared at the photograph, his mind was assaulted by fragmented images, memories he didn't remember having. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. Some things are better forgotten. He saw flashes of the woman's face, her smile warm but fleeting. He heard her laugh, soft and melodic, and then the sound of her crying, a deep, guttural sob that sent chills down his spine. And then he saw it, his grandmother standing behind the woman, her eyes cold and calculating. What are you seeing? Claire asked, her voice pulling him back to the present. Ethan shook his head, his heart pounding. I think she did something to this woman. To my father. What do you mean? Claire pressed. I don't know, Ethan admitted, but I think she wanted me to find this. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden thud, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway outside the room. Claire grabbed Ethan's arm, her eyes wide with fear. Did you hear that? She whispered. Ethan nodded, his pulse racing. He moved toward the door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted them to know they weren't alone. Stay here, Ethan told Claire, though his voice betrayed his own fear. No way, she replied, clutching his arm. We stay together. Ethan didn't argue. They stepped out into the hallway, the air colder than before. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched was palpable. Ethan's flashlight caught movement at the end of the hall, a shadow disappearing around the corner. Who's there? Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. There was no response, only the faint sound of breathing, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan turned the corner, his flashlight revealing another door, this one ajar. He pushed it open, the hinges creaking ominously. Inside was a smaller room, empty save for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat another photograph, this one pristine and untouched by time. Ethan picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. It was a picture of his grandmother, standing in front of Havenwood Manor, her smile cold and triumphant. Beside her was the same man from the first photograph, but this time he wasn't holding a baby. He was holding Ethan. What does this mean? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. I don't know, he said, but I think she planned this. All of it. Before Claire could respond, the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the single voice rose above the chaos. "The truth is yours, but it will cost you everything." The room plunged into darkness, leaving Ethan and Claire to face whatever horrors awaited them. As the shadows closed in and the truth began to take shape, one question loomed larger than all the rest. Could they survive the cost of knowing? How much of the truth is too much to bear? Can the weight of revelation destroy more than ignorance ever could? What would Ethan and Claire uncover, and what would it demand of them in return? The air felt heavy, suffocating, as the whispers grew louder, each syllable laced with malice and foreboding. Ethan clutched the photograph tightly, the edges crumpling under his grip. Beside him, Claire's breathing was uneven, her fear almost tangible in the dimly lit room. But it wasn't just the whispers. It was the overwhelming sense that they had crossed a line they couldn't retreat from. "Do you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible over the eerie hum filling the room. Ethan nodded. "It's like the house is alive." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the house at all. It was her. His grandmother's presence lingered, an oppressive force that seemed to seep into every shadow, every crack in the walls. The room had grown colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. Their breath fogged in front of them, and Claire rubbed her arms, her teeth chattering. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. There's more she wants us to see." "How can you be so sure?" Claire asked, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Because she's not finished with us," Ethan replied, his tone grim. "Not yet." Suddenly, the whisper stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. And then a single word echoed through the room, spoken in his grandmother's unmistakable voice. "Continue." Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. On the far side of the room, another object caught his attention. It was a mirror, tall and ornate, its surface clouded as though hiding something beneath. The frame was etched with symbols he didn't recognize, but they pulsed faintly, almost as if alive. "What is that?" Claire asked, stepping closer despite her fear. Ethan approached the mirror, his reflection distorted and shifting. But as he reached out to touch it, the surface rippled like water, and the room around them began to change. They were no longer in the small room. Instead, they stood in a grand hall, one Ethan recognized instantly. It was Havenwood Manor as it had been decades ago, restored to its former glory. The air was thick with the scent of roses, and the sound of faint laughter echoed down the corridors. "This can't be real," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. He was transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. His grandmother, younger and radiant, walked into view, her presence commanding and chilling. She was holding the hand of a young boy, a boy who looked just like Ethan. "Is that you?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, his stomach twisting into knots. "It can't be." But as they watched, the scene shifted again. The boy was older now, standing beside a woman Ethan had never seen before. Her features were delicate, her smile warm, but there was a sadness in her eyes that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Who is she?" Claire asked, stepping closer to the vision. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The answer was forming in his mind, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. The vision faded, and they were back in the small room, the mirror's surface rippling once more. Ethan stared at it, his breathing ragged. "She's showing us something," he said. "Something she wanted to keep hidden." "But why now?" Claire asked. "Why show us this at all?" "Because she's trying to make us understand," Ethan replied, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "But I don't think we're going to like what comes next." The mirror shimmered again, and this time they saw his grandmother standing in a dark room, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. She was speaking to someone, though her words were muffled. "Turn it up," Claire urged, her voice panicked. Ethan adjusted the volume knob on the recorder they brought with them, and the voice grew clearer. "It has to end with him," his grandmother was saying. The bloodline is tainted. It must be severed. Who are you talking about? The voice of an unseen figure asked. My grandson, she replied. He is the key. If he survives, the curse will continue. Ethan felt his blood run cold. What does she mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. She's talking about you, Ethan. She's saying you're part of this curse. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pulsing with an unnatural energy. The mirror cracked, and a surge of wind knocked them both to the ground. When they looked up, the mirror was gone, replaced by a door that hadn't been there before. Ethan and Claire exchanged a glance, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. They knew what they had to do, though neither of them wanted to say it out loud. We have to go through, Ethan said finally. Claire hesitated, but she nodded. What if it's a trap? It probably is, Ethan admitted, but we don't have a choice. Together, they stepped toward the door, their hands trembling as they pushed it open. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, but it seemed to call to them, pulling them forward. And as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, leaving them alone in the void. What awaited them in the darkness? Was it the truth they sought, or the final piece of his grandmother's sinister plan? And most importantly, would they survive it? What lies beyond the veil of darkness? Could Ethan and Claire uncover the secrets of Havenwood Manor, or would they be consumed by them? And, most importantly, could they ever truly escape? The darkness was alive. It pulsed and swirled around Ethan and Claire as if the shadows themselves were whispering their grandmother's secrets. Every breath felt heavy, every step more uncertain than the last. Do you hear it? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded. He did. It wasn't just whispers. It was laughter, faint and chilling, echoing from somewhere ahead. The air was damp and cold, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and stayed there. What's waiting for us? Claire asked, clutching his arm tightly. I don't know, Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. But we have to keep going. The corridor seemed endless, each step revealing more of the same oppressive blackness. But then a faint glow appeared in the distance, a door slightly ajar with light spilling out like a beacon. It was almost inviting, but Ethan knew better than to trust appearances. As they approached, the sound of voices grew louder. They weren't whispers anymore. They were clear, distinct. His grandmother's voice was unmistakable. But there was another voice, deeper and unfamiliar. What if it's a trap? Claire asked, her grip tightening. It probably is, Ethan admitted, but we don't have a choice. He pushed the door open, and the scene before them was like something out of a nightmare. The room was massive, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected distorted versions of reality. In the center stood his grandmother, her back to them, and beside her was a man Ethan didn't recognize. The man was tall and imposing, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood with a calm authority that made Ethan's skin crawl. His grandmother turned to face them, her expression eerily serene. You made it, she said, her voice devoid of surprise. I knew you would. Ethan stepped forward, his jaw clenched. What is this? Who is he? His grandmother smiled, a cold, calculated smile that held no warmth. This is the end, Ethan, or the beginning, depending on how you look at it. I'm done with your riddles. Ethan snapped. Tell me the truth. The truth, she repeated, her tone mocking. You think you can handle the truth? The man beside her finally spoke, his voice deep and commanding. It's time, Margaret. They deserve to know. Margaret, his grandmother, hesitated, her gaze flickering to the mirrors surrounding them. Very well, she said finally, but don't say I didn't warn you. She turned to Ethan, her eyes locking onto his. You're not just my grandson, Ethan. You're my undoing, my punishment. What are you talking about? Ethan demanded, his voice rising. Margaret's expression hardened. You were never meant to survive, Ethan. Your existence defies everything I've worked for. Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. He's your family. How could you say that? Margaret ignored her, her focus solely on Ethan. Do you remember the boy in the visions? The one who looked like you? Ethan nodded, his stomach twisting. Yes, that was my son, Margaret said. Your father. And the curse began with him. The room seemed to darken further as Margaret began to speak. She told them of a deal made generations ago, a pact forged in desperation. Her family had been on the brink of ruin, and the only way to save them was to give something in return. Something precious. My son was the price, Margaret said, her voice laced with bitterness. But I couldn't let him go, so I found another way. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What did you do? Margaret hesitated, and the man beside her spoke instead. She broke the pact, and in doing so, she cursed the entire bloodline. Margaret's voice grew cold. And now the curse falls on you, Ethan. You are the last piece of this puzzle. The only way to end it. Ethan's mind raced, the weight of her words threatening to crush him. What do you mean? End it. You must die, Margaret said bluntly. Only then will the curse be broken. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No, that's insane. Margaret's gaze softened, but only slightly. It's the only way, Ethan. If you don't, the curse will continue. It will consume everyone you love. Ethan stared at her, his heart pounding. You expect me to just sacrifice myself? It's not about expectation, the man said. It's about choice. You have the power to break this cycle, but only if you're willing to pay the price. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, anger, despair. He turned to Claire, her eyes wide with tears. What do I do? He whispered. Claire shook her head, her voice breaking. I don't know, Ethan. I don't know. Margaret stepped closer, her expression unreadable. The choice is yours, Ethan, but choose wisely. Time is running out. The mirrors around them began to ripple, the distorted reflections shifting and writhing. Ethan felt the ground beneath him tremble, the room seeming to close in around him. What happens if I refuse? He asked, his voice barely audible. Margaret's smile was chilling. Then you'll see what true suffering looks like. As the room descended into chaos, Ethan was left with an impossible choice, one that would change everything. What would Ethan choose? Could he find another way, or was he doomed to fulfill the curse's demands? And if he refused, what horrors awaited him and those he loved?